And the Town of Los Gatos Planning Commission meeting of April 26, 2023 is now called to order. For those who haven't already done so, please take a moment to silence your devices. And I'll take the roll. Commissioner Hanson?
Here.
Commissioner Thomas?
Here.
Vice Chair Raspi?
Here.
Commissioner Burnett?
Here.
And Commissioner Janov?
Here.
And Commissioner Clark will not be with us today. And of course, I am here. And before we start the meeting, as usual, I'll request staff to make a presentation on the rules of decorum and civility.
One second, Chair. It wasn't loaded. Now the audio is not working. So, Ms. Armour, do you have the brief version to read over there by chance?
Yes, I can do so. Here, the purpose of this meeting is to conduct the business of the community in an efficient and effective manner. So we ask that all members of the community who join this meeting please follow the meeting guidelines as set forth in town code and state law. The town does not tolerate disruptive conduct, which includes but is not limited to addressing the Planning Commission without first being recognized, interrupting speakers, planning commissioners, or town staff, continuing to speak after the allotted time has expired, failing to relinquish the microphone when directed to do so, repetitiously addressing the same subject. Town policy does not allow speakers to cede their commenting time to another speaker, and disruption of the meeting may result in a violation of Penal Code Section 403. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And so we'll next move on to the Pledge of Allegiance, and I'll ask Commissioner Janov to lead us today.
Join us. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
So I have a few preliminary remarks regarding the procedure tonight. First, during tonight's meeting, any person who desires to be recognized by the chair must either submit a card, which are behind the benches, or indicate so on Zoom by raising your hand. As to public comments, they are to be directed to the commission as a body and not to the audience. No person other than the commissioner, staff, and the person having the floor shall be permitted to enter into the discussion. No person shall be allowed to speak a second time on any issue. And to assure the opportunity for all those desiring to speak, there's no yielding of time to another speaker. In fairness to all, the time limit for presentation by members of the public is 3 minutes, unless extended by the chair. As the Planning Commission conducts the meeting this evening, we encourage public participation, which is essential to our democracy and to the critical work of the Planning Commission. Public input is very much welcomed, and comments are always carefully considered by the Commission in our deliberations. Your participation may occur in several ways. First, written comments on agenda items may be submitted to the staff prior to the meeting, and these comments are always appreciated, and we have received several for this meeting. And during the meeting, there are 2 opportunities for members of the public to participate. First, during our verbal communications period, An individual may speak on any topic that is not on the agenda for tonight's meeting. And during the hearing on each specific agenda item, members may speak about that item. And you'll be advised when those opportunities arise. And for those who are here, please come to the mic when you wish to speak and speak directly into it. And we'd appreciate your stating your name and address if you're willing to. Otherwise, you can appear anonymously. And same thing on the cards. You can indicate that you're speaking anonymously. So we now come to the verbal communication portion of our agenda. And members of the public are invited to address the commission, as I said, on any issue that is not on the agenda for tonight's meeting. And staff will announce when your 3-minute time limit is up. And I'll start with Mr. Paulson. Do we have anyone on Zoom who wishes to participate?
Thank you, Chair. I do not see any hands raised for items that are not on the agenda.
Thank you, Mr. Paulson. And I don't have any cards. Are there any members of the audience who wish to present a card to be heard on matters not on the agenda? Not seeing any. So we'll move on to the consent calendar. Tonight we have one item in the consent calendar, which is the approval of our meeting minutes for March 22, 2023. And before I'll ask if any of the members of the commission wish to withdraw that item from the consent calendar. I don't see any. And seeing none, we'll move on to the approval of the minutes of the commission, a meeting of March 22nd. And I'll ask if any of the commissioners have proposed amendments to those minutes. Seeing none, do we have a motion to approve the consent calendar? Commissioner Hanson?
I move that we approve the consent calendar, which consists of the meeting minutes from our last meeting.
Thank you. And a second? Commissioner Thomas?
I second the motion.
All right. Is there any discussion? Seeing none, I'll call the question and conduct the roll. Commissioner Hanson?
Yes.
Commissioner Thomas?
Yes.
Vice Chair Raspy?
Yes.
Commissioner Burnett?
Yes.
Commissioner Janov?
Yes.
And I vote yes as well, so it passes unanimously. So now we'll move on to new public hearings. And at staff suggestion, we're going to promote agenda item 4 to the beginning of the discussion for the convenience of the town representatives who are making themselves available on this item. And we are requested to provide a recommendation to the town council concerning the draft proposed capital improvement budget for the fiscal years 2023, 2024, and 2027, 2028. And more particularly, to make a finding regarding the CEQA exception and whether the subjects addressed in the CIP budget are consistent with the general plan, the North 40 specific plan, the Albright specific plan, and the Hillside specific plan. Are there any disclosures by commissioners on this item? Seeing none, I understand the staff will present a report on this issue at this time, right?
Yes, good
Thank you.
evening, Planning Commission and Chair. I'm Nicole Burnham. I'm your Director of Parks and Public Works. It's nice to see you all. This is my first time with you live and in person. So I'm just going to give you a brief overview and presentation to provide some information about the capital improvement program. If we go to the next slide. So as you stated, your role is to provide CEQA clearance and also find consistency with the general plan as well as other planning documents for the town. So next slide, thank you, Joel. So this is an overview of the funding sources that we have to work with. So our biggest funding source in the capital program generally is the GFAR, the General Fund Reserve, and inputs to that are things like cost sharing. For example, we're in a cost sharing arrangement right now with San Jose on some roadway work where they do the work, we pay them, and vice versa. There's construction impact fees. We also have some Measure G funding that comes into the GFAR. We've got ARPA funding. And we have general fund capital, special projects reserve. We get Measure B funding comes into GFAR. And then there's a series on the right of other funding sources that a lot of which fund our roadway work, such as the traffic mitigation plan. We have a number of grant programs and projects, utility undergrounding, gas tax fees. There's also a storm drainage impact fee that we use to fund projects. So all of that funding gets aggregated together and distributed into projects. And the next slide shows how we distribute those projects. So if you look at the capital budget, it's divided into three major programs. One is the streets program, which includes reconstruction and resurfacing, maintenance improvements, bridge projects. The Parks and Trail program is exactly what it says, Parks and Trails. The Public Facilities program is really about taking care of town-owned assets and buildings and the like. So with this proposed budget, as we started out on this journey of developing the budget, back in February, we kind of set some intentions and goals. And we reviewed these with both the Finance Commission and Town Council in March and got their feedback. And generally speaking, here were the goals that we set forward. First of all, we wanted to kind of close out any projects that were still on the books that were either done, essentially done, or that we may not have been able to move forward with for whatever reason. We recommended, and council gave us recommendation to add 3 ongoing funds, which means every year we will continue to add money to these projects to continue to work on them. One is roadside vegetation management, one is open space vegetation management, and those are very specifically related to wildfire mitigation. And then an ADA compliance, American with Disabilities Act compliance fund. So we've had an ADA compliance plan completed for the town, and we know we've got some areas we need to work on. So we want to start putting money aside each year to be able to make some at least small improvements with that funding. We have also a number of projects in our capital budget that are either underfunded or were never fully funded to begin with. We're underfunded because prices have escalated. So we really wanted to shore up funding on those projects. We also wanted to give some consideration to Parks and Trails, which really don't have a dedicated funding source. So we kind of want to highlight that and be able to have that conversation ongoing with the community in the coming budget years. But we also wanted to provide for unanticipated repairs. There are a number of times, and it's actually happened 3 times this year, where we've had things come up that needed attention and needed capital construction spending. And it's nice to have a funding source that we can just go to the town manager for authorization on, rather than having to go through council action. And these are, there were 2 of them were drainage projects that were relatively small, but still needed a contractor to be hired. And then the rest of that funding that we had in this fiscal year is going to help repair sidewalks and fences that were impacted from the storms and tree uplift. So we recommended that fund be established on an ongoing basis. So I'll talk through some projects, but I'll do it in context of consistency with the general plan. And I did it element by element. So first, to talk about the mobility element, the bulk of our capital spending really is around mobility and transportation related improvements. So we continue to have a couple of big projects in here, the Highway 17 Bike and Ped Bridge and the Highway 17 Route 9 interchange projects are 2 really large projects that continue to be in our capital program. Every year we're doing annual street resurfacing and repair. And Shannon Road Complete Streets, we actually use this budget cycle to shore up the funding for that and to ensure we have enough money to get through construction. Under public facility services and infrastructures, I mentioned earlier the ongoing ADA compliance. We didn't add a lot of new projects in this sector this year because, quite frankly, we have a lot that are ongoing, that are currently funded, so we'll continue to work those off. Next slide. Under open space, parks, and recreation, Creekside Park artificial turf needs replacement. So we started funding that. It's not fully funded, but we started funding it in this budget cycle. There is a proposed community garden and also a pathway at Lynn Avenue in the budget documents. We've had enough money to start thinking about the design of that. But we proposed money, additional funding, so we're starting to build up a chest for construction for that project as we move forward. We also included money for inspection of our timber bridges that are in the trail system. We have 3 of them that I'm aware of. Under environment and sustainability, one area that we haven't funded much in the last few years is relating to storm drainage. So we hit this pretty hard this year because there's a lot of needs, and January and March really showed us where all the weak spots are. The new projects are really in that arena. And lastly, hazards and safety element. So I mentioned earlier all 3 of these items, but for us, our primary focus really is around fuel reduction. I mean, that is a big effort that Parks and Public Works is working on an ongoing basis. So we work to shore up funding associated with that for next year and for the ongoing years. And also, we have grants, particularly the roadside fuel reduction project has grant money from both FEMA and the United States Department of Agriculture, but those grants needed matching funds. So we put money into these programs to make sure that we had enough match for the grants. And then I mentioned the unanticipated earlier. So we are hoping to find this project categorically exempt. We hope you'll agree that these projects are consistent with our planning documents and that you'll forward a recommendation of approval to the town council.
There you go. Thanks so much for that presentation, Ms. Burnham. And I'll ask if commissioners have questions of staff at this time. Oh, I meant to ask you, who are the other representatives of the town who are here?
I'm so glad you asked me that. Thank you. I meant to say that earlier. So we have, I have Gary Heap, town engineer, with me here, and on Zoom I have Stephanie Hockmeyer, who is the senior analyst, and it looks like we also have James Watson, a senior engineer, with my program. All are here.
Great. Thank you for that. And so I'll now ask commissioners if they have questions of staff, beginning with Commissioner Hanson.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I have 2 questions. You mentioned projects for mobility. I was curious where we stand in general with the bike and pedestrian master plan. Are there still a bunch of projects that need to happen that aren't scheduled yet?
Yes, thank you for that question. Yeah, the short answer is yes. We actually, my team's been doing an update to that. Not an update. We've been working on a communication tool, I should say, to help people understand what projects, where we are in the delivery of that project. So actually on our website, there's a story map where you can click on and see. We haven't formally blasted that out yet, but it's already there on the website. So you can go into that and see exactly where we stand, but there's a number of projects remaining.
Great. Thank you for that. And then my second question, it was a more general one. Are there some very big projects that you would have liked to have put in the capital budget, but could not because of the priorities of fire safety and all that? I'm not questioning the priorities. I'm just curious how much is out there that's not being taken care of.
Yeah, another good question. I think I've never worked on a capital budget that didn't have unfunded needs. I think generally, I think our biggest needs remain around parks and trails. And in the budget document itself, at the front of each section, there is a list of unfunded project needs. So you can peruse that, but there's not any coming to mind specifically right now that I think are fully unfunded.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Thomas, I think you had your hand up.
Thank you. I did have a follow-up question about the bike and pedestrian master plan, and that was that is there a lot of grant funding available for future projects that you guys are planning out kind of the pathway for right now? We're definitely always evaluating potential grants. Right now, as a department, we are managing 28 grants in values of over $14 million. So we're sort of
getting our arms around that right now. A lot of them are bike pads, some of them are fire related, but we continue to seek new sources, but we're also working to really, quite frankly, deliver on the projects we already have grants for. Yeah.
Anyone else wish to be heard on presenting questions to staff on this? If not, I have a question. As to the ADA funding, I'm wondering how that amount was determined and whether, this might be outside the question that's before us, but do we have any sense of how many ADA claims have been made against the town and whether this should be expedited?
I don't know the number of claims that have been made. I don't have any idea. I do know that we had when we had the ADA plan done, we had an unmet need, let's say around 20 million. I can't remember the number off the top of my head, but it was significant because we have issues all over town. So it's going to take a long time for us to address all those issues. And I think the important thing is that we continue to just try to address them. So the funding that's in the budget could be much higher, and we could find use for it. But we sort of took what we felt like we had available to at least start to think about it. And I will also just say that anytime we're planning for a new project, we are incorporating ADA improvements. So like that funding source isn't the only one for ADA improvements. For example, we're about to embark on a renovation in this building of some of the restrooms. And as a result of that, we'll make certain ADA upgrades.
Thank you, that's helpful. And I think you said this in the staff report, but it's expected that the funding sources that are mentioned will continue throughout the period of the budget?
Yes, and we're programming it. When we program money into projects, we're confident it exists. So we're not programming money on the hope that it's going to be there. So
Great, thanks again. No more questions? Or Commissioner Burnett?
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Ms. Burnham, for your great report. So as I was going through the costs of all the different projects proposed, and a lot of them seem to be with the design, the cost of the design. I'm not seeing a lot with the final construction, like when we're talking about the bicycle, what is it, the Highway 17 bicycle and pedestrian, we're talking about $20 to $30 million needed for construction. So when I'm looking at a lot of these, we talk about design and the cost, and a lot of them are very high costs for design. But I'm not seeing any figures for what the actual construction is going to finally end up being. And I know that's not our purview, but since we did get this in the document, I just had a question about that. Thank you.
yeah, no, it's a very good question. So we do have that data, and when, as we're building out the budget and thinking about where projects are underfunded, and you will notice when you look through the proposed projects that for some of those larger projects, where we could and where we felt like funding was available, we are starting to program in the out years to be able to provide for the construction cost. And you won't see that on the overcrossing projects, but you will see it on the Highway 17 Route 9 interchange, where you'll see in the out years we've tagged $800,000 a year to start building up our required match for that project. So we are starting to think that way and starting to work toward that.
Okay, if there are no more questions by the commissioners, we'll open up the public portion of the public meeting and invite comments from members of the public. Again, use the raised hand feature on Zoom or submit a card to staff. And we don't have any cards. Oh, we have one. Thank you. So Mr. Faggett, if you would come forward, I appreciate it.
Good evening. Lee Fago. I'm speaking tonight as a resident of the town of Los Gatos for 20 plus years, not representing any organization. Thank you for all the work that you and the town staff has been doing on our behalf for the entire community. So thank you. I wanted to speak tonight on item 4, specifically the Highway 17 bicycle and pedestrian bridge. I'm all for safety, and particularly for kids, to make our community as safe as possible for our next generation. And the Blossom Hill improvements that were made a couple of years ago, it was an iterative process, and that did seem to make some help. It did go a long ways toward making some help towards improvement of safety. However, looking at this draft of what this new bridge could be and the initial number of $23 million, I'm concerned. And the reason is, I believe we should be delaying it because the state and Caltran, they're doing some Highway 17 widening proposals. They're looking to work at Blossom Hill to redo that bridge that's there now because it does not meet the state requirements. It is too low. There's already been an accident with a truck hitting it, and they know that they're going to be working on it. They've talked about plans on how they're going to redo the Blossom Hill Road bridge over Highway 17. So if we put in our own separate bicycle and pedestrian bridge, we're going to be competing with Caltrans for funding. We're going to be competing with them to have a separate entrance and exit around that area for the kids. And to me, it's something that should be delayed at this time. I recommend that you consider delaying any further consideration on that project until we have a better understanding of what's going to happen with the funding for Caltrans to work on the Route 9 and 17 interchange, the route, the Blossom Hill Road, new bridge over Highway 17, and see if there's a way to collaborate with the state and include a better bicycle and pedestrian overcrossing as part of that new construct, rather than doing our own separate, and it's going to end up being $30 million plus by time if we go forward with that. And given the budget issues in this town and the projections going forward, I think that's not wise use of money, and I ask that you recommend to the council they pull that off the list for now, and let's work with Caltrans to come up with a better solution. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Fago, and I'll ask commissioners if they have questions for you. Not seeing any. Thanks again. So we'll now close the public portion of the public hearing and ask commissioners if they have questions of staff, wish to comment on the request, or make a motion concerning the recommendation to the town council concerning the draft proposed capital improvement program budget for the ensuing fiscal year period 2023, 2024, and 2027, 2028. Commissioner Vice Chair Raspy.
Thank you, Chair. I was just hoping we could get staff's response to Mr. Fago's comments, and I'd appreciate hearing them from them on that. Thank you.
Sure. I would say comment noted. But that project is in the Bike Ped Master Plan. The improvements there are definitely a high priority. The project is currently funded through design, and the contracts are in place for that. And then I think we have a question about how we go to construction or how we proceed from there. When the project was first conceived, they did a feasibility assessment, and we have coordinated with Caltrans. I'm sorry, I can't remember offhand why we didn't. I don't believe that they're planning to modify that bridge at this time, which is why we moved separately. We did look at co-locating and basically having our bridge abut to theirs, like structurally connected. But because their structure's too low, we couldn't do that. But I think at this point, like I said, the project's fully funded, and it's definitely a key part of our consistency with your mobility element.
Thanks so much. I appreciate that.
Other questions by commissioners? Commissioner Janoff.
Just a sort of a follow-up to the question asked. Is it fair to say that staff is coordinating with Caltrain and other organizations on whatever work they're doing to make sure that we aren't duplicating efforts so that we are fiscally prudent about how we're spending these funds?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. And then I would just like to say thank you again to staff. This is the 7th or 8th year that I've seen the capital improvement plan, the budget. It always impresses me how much work has gone into it, the thoughtfulness, the coordination, and the collaboration among the different departments. It makes me proud as a resident, as well as a planning commissioner, to see this kind of work. And I just wanted to thank you for that.
Thank you. And Commissioner Burnett, you had a hand up?
Yes, thank you. So a follow-up, so you say this, we're fully funded on the bicycle, this Highway 17 and Blossom Hill Road, that bicycle,
For the design,
for the design?
yeah. Did I say construction? If I did, I misspoke. Oh, okay, all right.
So we still have to come up with $20 to $30 million?
Yes.
That's what we're saying. Okay, thank you.
Other questions? If not, I would entertain a motion. Oh, Commissioner Thomas, please.
Thank you, Chair. I do have just one more question about the Lynn Avenue pathway and community garden. Just kind of in general, how what is the timeline for that project, just so that the public is aware, because it's a so they can be involved.
We are just in the process of hiring the consultant, so we should be coming to council in June with a contract award, we hope. So we'll be working on concept sketches and design through the fall. So you should see more about it and more community engagement opportunities.
All right, well, I'll still entertain a motion. Commissioner Raspy, our Vice Chair, and Commissioner.
Thank you. First, on behalf of the entire Planning Commission, I want to thank staff for their extraordinary efforts in putting this together. And I would like to make a motion to forward a recommendation of approval to the Town Council for the proposed draft capital improvement program budget for fiscal years 2023, 2024 through 2027, 2028. And I can make the findings that the project is exempt from CEQA and that the potential projects in the 2023 through 2024 through 2027, 2028 draft proposed CIP are consistent with the general plan, the North 40 specific plan, the Albright specific plan, and the Hillside specific plan.
Thank you for that motion. And we have a second. Commissioner Janoff?
I'll second the motion.
Is there any further discussion? Seeing none, I'll call the roll. Commissioner Hanson?
Yes.
Commissioner Thomas?
Yes.
Vice Chair Raspy?
Yes.
Commissioner Burnett?
Yes.
Commissioner Janoff?
Yes.
And I vote as well in favor of the motion, so it passes unanimously. I want to add my thanks to staff, too, for their excellent work. Oh, I meant to ask Ms. Armour, this is a recommendation, so there's no appeal rights, correct?
That is correct.
Thank you. So we'll now move on to agenda item number 2, which is a request that the Planning Commission forward a recommendation to the Town Council on land use and economic recovery amendments to Chapter 29, the zoning regulations of the Town of Los Gatos, code regarding personal service businesses, bars, markets, banks, financial services, formula retail, group classes, veterinarians, offices, and the definitions. And the proposed amendments to the town code are not considered a CEQA project. And I'll ask if there are any disclosures by the commissioners. See none. I'll again ask if staff has a report on item 2.
Great, thank you and good evening. Throughout the years, the council has identified strategic priorities related to community vitality, economic recovery, permit streamlining, and policies and ordinances related to supporting the business community. In line with these priorities, staff has brought forth a series of policy and ordinance changes over time, offering reduced costs, streamlined processes, and flexibility. In response to the pandemic emergency, the Town Council adopted an economic recovery resolution to provide businesses with options for flexibility to modify their business offerings. Excuse me. As a result, the town experienced fewer vacancies and business attrition during the pandemic and was quick to assist businesses in reopening. The council recently adopted a priority related to economic vitality and pandemic recovery. And tonight, as a first step, staff is bringing forward recommendations for code amendments to formalize some components of the economic recovery resolution and to continue the streamlining work that began prior to the pandemic emergency to support the business community during the recovery. Your staff report and exhibits detail the 6 subjects for which staff is seeking a recommendation to the commission from the commission to the council. And briefly, these 6 items are allowing personal service businesses as a permitted use in the C2 and O zones, defining new uses to increase flexibility and opportunity for different business models within the restaurants to bar spectrum, introducing new definitions for banks and financial investment services to better clarify the uses, reducing regulatory impediments to large formula retail businesses, allowing group classes as permitted use in the C2 zone, and allowing veterinarians without a kennel to operate in the C1 zone with a CUP. A thorough discussion of each topic is included with your staff report. An addendum has been distributed, including public comments received after the publishing of the staff report. And in conclusion, staff recommends the Planning Commission review and provide a motion on each of the proposed amendments and forward a recommendation to the Town Council. Along with planning staff, Monica Wren, the town's Economic Vitality Manager, is here tonight to support your discussion and answer any questions you might have. And this concludes my presentation, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Mullen. Are there questions from the commissioners? Commissioner Hanson.
I had 2 questions. One is about a personal service business. I seem to remember reading in the news, it was maybe a while ago, there were some issues, and I did a little bit of checking. There has been on and off issues with massage parlors and illicit activities of various sorts. None that I could find in Los Gatos, but in the Bay Area, yes, San Jose and whatnot. So I didn't see it clearly called out as a permitted use in the discussion, but then when I went and looked at the definitions page, massage therapist was in there. So my question is do we have a reason to maybe think twice about that particular category?
Thank you for that question. I know you have a follow-up as well, but the massage therapists that come in, it is permitted in certain zones. And those operators that want to come in and open that business need to obtain a use and not use and occupancy, excuse me, use and occupancy, sorry. Use and occupancy permit as well. And under that permit process, they need to receive clearance from PD, the police department, and provide that information to the town. That's how the town typically is regulating it, and the commission could discuss carving that out if that's something that they're amenable to.
Okay, I was just kind of curious, and I do imagine that we have code, not only code enforcement, but also our police department, should anything like that happen, people report it, it could be, addressed.
Really. And to follow up on that, the regulations that we're looking at in the C2 zone are really specific locationally. It's really about ground floor in the C2 zone. In other zones, and it's a permitted use, and in the C2 zone, if you're not ground floor, it's a permitted use.
Okay, very good. So my other question is about the formula retail, which has been a big discussion topic for many, many years. There was a time where I thought we used to track the percentage of large retail versus, smaller retails. I mean, do we do that anymore? And, where do we stand?
So we stopped tracking, Monica Wren, Economic Vitality Manager, we stopped tracking that back when we got rid of the formula retail regulations for establishments under 6,000 square feet. Right now, the question is, do we want to expand that to those over 6,000 square feet? So I could quickly probably look down North Santa Cruz on a map and come up with a number for you. But since the removal of that regulation, I think we've only even had 1 or 2 come in, and that was in 2018.
Okay, very good.
There we go. Other commissioners have questions of staff? I'm not seeing any, so we'll now open the public portion of the public meeting and invite comments on this item from members of the public. And we do have a card on this now. And Mr. Paulson, are there any members of the public on Zoom who wish to speak? Okay, so again, if you'd please come to the mic to speak. State your name and address if you wish.
Okay, I'm Catherine Summers, Executive Director at the Los Gatos Chamber of Commerce. I'm kind of surprised that there's not a lot more people wanting to speak on this issue, but I am here on behalf of my board of directors. We would like to express our appreciation of the staff's continued work on economic recovery and streamlining of the new business permitting process. Certainly, the June 2020 Economic Recovery Resolution did create flexibility and increased opportunities for existing and new businesses. We particularly appreciated the subsidies provided for those that wanted to update their CUPs. It added vitality and vibrancy. Tonight, we're here to support almost everything that the staff recommends in this report as it relates to making that 2020 resolution permanent. However, we have a few exceptions. We hope tonight you will take a little closer look at the language around specialty retail and how it might relate to the coffee industry. The downtown core currently has a unique and abundant variety of coffee businesses. We feel the discretion provided by the Development Review Committee level will be appropriate to guide any newly proposed coffee businesses in the C2. In other areas, we're not as concerned. We also want to point out that Formula Retailers' 5,000 square feet was a policy meant to regulate larger box retail. In hindsight, that number could have been altered or addressed a few years ago when the resolution was put in place, and it was not. There are some spaces in the commercial zone, again C2, that would benefit from marketability of what would be considered a formula use as an approved use within the zone. There are leases in place, building size, and other constraints that self-regulate the concern of overly competitive big box retailers entering the market and creating destructive competition for our mom and pop retailers. The notion of formula retailers is antiquated. With aggressively changing landscape of retail, we almost want to welcome a few quality retailers that are left to bolster our shopping experience and gain tax revenue. We suggest eliminating this limitation completely. Lastly, we also think the definition of banks and financial institutions needs to be more straightforward. Recalling the Planning Commission meeting about a year ago, you unanimously agreed to allow Charles Schwab to open in the now vacated Gap space. The Chamber appealed that. The council agreed with our appeal and denied the project. In that, we did say that the definition should include ATMs and to having cash on hand. I'm running out of time here. But I think you should really be specific with that definition so that we don't run into that same problem. That is, if you do not want to have offices on the ground floor. Again, we appreciate everything that you do and all of the elements of this plan.
Just on time there. Thanks so much for that presentation and for all you do for the town of Los Gatos. And I'll ask if there are any questions.
Oh, gosh.
Commissioner Hanson.
Thank you, as always, for your great comments and encouragement of and help and input in what we're doing for our town businesses. There was a letter in the addendum from actually one of our general plan committee members, who's also an architect, raising the question about the competition with the small businesses, and I felt like I knew the answer to it because I attended a presentation on the future of retail about 5 years ago, and everything has come true and is continuing to come true. But my question to you is, I don't know if you had seen that letter, but do you feel confident that were we to make these changes, that we aren't going to push out a bunch of small business owners that would want to be setting up retail locations?
So I have a perfect example of that. So Arhaus, which is taking over Banana Republic and the Sur La Table space, I want to say, and Monica may know, at least 8,000 square feet. I think it's huge space. And I was a little concerned when I heard that they were coming into the Old Town space. And before I could even go out and talk to some of our members or just the businesses, business owners that I know, Sherry Rose said, awesome that they're coming. And the reason is, she said that, and so did the maids' quarters. And the reason is, you have a draw like that in town, and people come to that, but then they stay and they have lunch, and then they do venture into Sherry Rose's, and they go into the maids' quarters, and then they go into the boutique. So those things, those big retailers that are now out there that have made it through all of this attrition of all the, the legacy stores, they call them, those are the ones that people come to, and they will help our mom and pops. I really believe that.
Thank you for that.
Commissioner Thomas?
I do have a follow-up to that question, and again, thank you for coming tonight and offering some suggestions. Do you feel like your members feel that way about like with Sephora and Anthropology there? I mean, Sephora's not that big, but like, is that what they're seeing with like those two locations? People are coming to those spots and then staying around downtown?
Yes, I think that people, as much as, competition is certainly a thing, but I think it's the crowd massing that is more important. And so if people are coming for Sephora, again, to, exactly as I said to Melanie, they do then walk around. They parked once and they're kind of like, okay, what else does this town have to offer? Oh, I'm going to come here for dinner.
They're going to go to icing on the cake.
Yeah, they see so much.
Yeah,
I mean,
okay.
it's the same true as Anthropology and I mean,
Yeah.
all of those stores. They really, Warby Parker, a huge
Yeah.
addition to town because people are coming here for that. And then they venture out and see everything else that we have here.
Okay. So I do have a follow-up, if that's okay, through the.
Please.
Okay. So you just want to eliminate all so that there's
That's
no issues associated with that? Can you just repeat your recommendation?
So that's a big ask, and that is what my
Yeah.
board actually does recommend, is
Okay.
eliminating it completely. Partly because they think, and Monica could answer some of this as well, the market economics downtown, first of all, there's not that many spaces that are over 10,000 feet. You have, so 6,800, so the Williams-Sonoma, Hero Ranch, that whole space is 6,800 feet, right? And that will be more marketable to a really high-end, cool retailer if it doesn't have all those restrictions and, all that other stuff lopped onto it. It's going to take a whole long time to go through the whole process, the building process, right? Like those big companies still look at all that stuff and they think, okay, how do I come in easily and open up shop as quickly as I can, kind of thing, and which is kind of what our house was able to do.
Okay.
So I don't know if that answered your question.
that
So I don't
did.
think you
Thank
have the
you.
problem downtown. I mean, I don't think you have to worry downtown that that's going to happen, that there's going to be retailers that we don't want downtown. I think
Yeah.
we want to make it as easy as possible.
Okay, thank you. And then my other question was, could you just clarify the definition about the banks?
Yes. So with the banks, I don't know if you remember. So last year it was Charles Schwab, I believe, that wanted to go in where the Gap space is. And it was a big, pretty contentious debate about what qualified as a bank. And I remember talking about, okay, could dogs go in and did they have dog biscuits? I think Melanie, somebody said that. And we really believe that to be a banking institution, or to consider yourself a bank where people are going in and out all day, so that it's sort of, I don't know, that it brings people in. It's not an office. You really do need to have an ATM, and you need to have cash on hand that you're doing transactions with people, and you're talking, and you're not just going into your office, offices like a Charles Schwab. I mean, that brings up a whole nother conversation, really, about our banks in town have such a big footprint. It's like what to do with them as we move through. I think that may be next to come, but I think banks are getting smaller and smaller, and so you really do want to make sure that you have that face-to-face communication at the banks. Maybe that's the other thing you put in. There's got to be some, face-to-face, or at least face with an ATM machine.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions of the speaker? No? Thank you very much. And we have a card from Bess, forgive me if I messed up your last name, Wursema.
Hi, I'm Bess Worsema. I'm a local architect. You guys all know me probably from my one business, Studio 3, which is in town. I also own another business called Shop the Studio. That's a trade-only showroom. It occupies about 8,000 square feet, and it sits at that second level of the Opera House. And I would just like to concur and support exactly what the chamber is saying, because I hear it from both my own clients at Studio 3 who are looking to have maybe some work done on their own homes or build a new home, but as well as a ton of other designers and architects that use the trade showroom that we operate. And that is that if downtown is vital, it's easier for them to get clients to come and visit here and stay more. And one might assume that our house going in, similar to like a Restoration Hardware or something, might be in direct competition with a designer who maybe wants to be able to sell to the trade or only product available, as opposed to having their clients go in and shop at an our house or a Restoration Hardware or Harvest or anything like that. But you know, honestly, they've all said that they welcome it, just like Sherry Rose did. I think the more we can establish ourselves as a boutique destination with not big box stores that are like Bed Bath & Beyond or Walmart, but with ones that fit at that more niche level. And those are the kind of businesses that are only going to take 10,000 feet or less. You know, those of us who have to do business plans and qualify for SBA loans and meet just the general needs of running a business, whether it's retail or trade only, you know, manage all the time any bank loans we have with what is the footprint of our space, how much traffic are we getting, and how can we increase traffic to us while still maintaining, you know, the unique nature of maybe why we have chosen to be in a location. So I would encourage you to let the architecture of the space and the footprint of the space do the talking and eliminate exactly what you're afraid of and create a space and a place that can become something besides just the same old stuff that we see downtown, because that's the only thing right now we're attracting is the same stuff that we all know exists. All right, that's it, just as a local business owner.
Before you go, I want to ask commissioners if they have any questions of you. But I'm not saying any. So thanks again. So we don't have anyone on Zoom or further cards, so I will now close the public portion of the public hearing on item 2. And I'm going to propose to my fellow commissioners that we proceed through each of the suggested amendment groups, A through F in turn, and ask the commissioners on each item if they have questions of staff, wish to comment on the request, or make a motion to the town council concerning the proposed amendments. And I understand that each motion will need to include the required findings that are on Exhibit 1 on page 27 of the report. And let's see if we have anything further before we go on. It was my intent to see if we can get through this item before we take a break, but if it ends up being rather long, then we'll certainly take a break, and anyone can suggest that we do that. So, is there a staff report on this item?
Staff would be happy to provide additional detail if you'd like as we go item to item. I didn't prepare remarks, but I can provide a brief summary as we go. Yeah, or we can just answer questions, whatever you prefer.
Okay, why don't we proceed in that way?
Okay.
So, let's see. Yeah, page 14. Item A is personal service businesses as a permitted use in the C2 and O zones. And this relates to all the many businesses that are described there, which I won't read. And I'll ask commissioners, based on the staff report or any questions they may have of staff, what their thoughts are on that project, on that proposed amendment. Yes, Commissioner Hanson.
After reading through it, the only question that I have is the one that I brought up about the massage parlors, and I'm satisfied with staff's response to that, in that that they have to communicate with the police department prior to operating their business anyways, and we also have code enforcement and police enforcement, you know, should anything happen. And considering the spirit of this, that we really need to give all our businesses all the help they can get to continue to move forward, I think we should take away, you know, any more impediments to opening these kinds of businesses. And these are exactly the kind of businesses that don't have a lot of money to throw into permits. So I would say yes on A.
Other comments? Commissioner Janoff?
Yes, and then Commissioner Thomas has her hand up. I just wanted to kind of back up a bit and say, you know, what the town did to provide assistance during the pandemic. And, you know, the town was struggling before in some respects with regard to retail. The pandemic just sort of forced the issue. The changes that were put in place made a whole lot of sense at that time, and they still make really good sense. And so I think this is, reading through the entire item, I was just really happy to see so much good change that would be assisting businesses. The other thing I'd like to say is we've been reminded on occasion that businesses really know what businesses need to do to be successful themselves. So creating hurdles when we don't need to have hurdles. When the business owners already know, they tick through their requirements, what their expectations are. This has come up with regard to parking as well. If they can make an argument for themselves and their bankers to be successful, then I think we should do whatever we can to make that a successful outcome. So I am also in favor of item A.
Thank you. And Commissioner Thomas?
Yes, I did have a question about the adding personal service businesses to the required parking for retail and commercial shops. I know that we're kind of the trend around the country, and here is that we're like trying to reduce like parking minimums and everything. So could you just elaborate on that and talk about why it wasn't, what's happening with that? Thank you.
Sure, thank you. So this is actually just recognizing formally how we already regulate it. It's just not in the code. So this is an opportunity not only to introduce these streamlined processes and flexibility, but also to catch some things that is just kind of contained in staff's knowledge and put it in the code to provide more clarity and make it easier moving forward.
Okay, so we're already doing this is basically what we're saying.
That's correct.
Is there any concern that we like soon in the future might be moving away from what we are currently doing because the trend is to, go away from parking minimums and things?
I think Planning Manager Armour can speak to that.
Thank you.
Thank you for that question. Yes, I would say that we do hope in the future to be looking comprehensively at our parking regulations, but at this time it is helpful to staff to be able to have that clarity in the code, consistent with what the regulations are for other uses.
Okay, so we would have to update. If this is included, it's not like then we're going to have to go back and undo it because we're going to have to go back and undo a lot of stuff across all of our code.
Correct.
Okay.
I anticipate a comprehensive update if we do get to the point of updating the parking code.
Perfect. Thank you.
Other questions or comments on this item? Commissioner Rusby?
Thank you, Chair. Just a procedural comment as to the form of the motion. I understand we have several changes that would be included. Would the motion include all of those changes, or could we simply refer to the changes noted in the report?
You could simply refer to the report.
All right. With that being said, Chair, I'd like to make a motion.
Please proceed.
Thank you. I would like to, with respect to the category of personal services businesses as a permitted use in the C2 and 0 zones, I would like to forward a recommendation to the Town Council for the changes as noted in the staff report on page 5 of our staff report specifically. And do I have to make any specific findings?
You can make the findings that are listed at the end of the report, or we could have a final motion referring back to the individual motions, at which time the findings could be made. It's up to the commission.
Chair, I will go ahead and make them. I'll just make the findings as referenced in the report. So it's a self-contained motion.
Very good. Do we have a second? Commissioner Janoff?
Second.
Discussion? Seeing none, I'll take the roll. And Commissioner Hanson?
Yes.
Commissioner Thomas?
Yes.
Vice Chair Raspy?
Yes.
Commissioner Burnett? Excuse me?
Yes.
We're not related. And Commissioner Janoff?
Yes.
And I vote yes as well, so it passes unanimously. And now we can move on to item B, which is on page 16. And this concerns bars, markets, and other miscellaneous commercial businesses. And staff is still standing by for any questions that we may have. But I'm, at this time, going to invite any questions or comments that commissioners may have on item B. Commissioner Henson.
I was just going to make a comment that I read through the comments on item B, and I didn't find anything that needed to be changed or that I was concerned about.
Okay, thank you. Other comments? Vice Chair Raspy.
Thanks, Chair. Just one question. I was curious as to, Tap Tasting Room has operating hours of 10 a.m. To 10 p.m. I was just curious how those hours were determined. Is it what other jurisdictions are using? I'm just curious as to how we came up to that definition.
Thank you for that question. We looked at some businesses in other cities and kind of looked at their hours. We tried to find some other municipalities that had this category, and I wasn't very successful in that. But we also recognized what the ABC licensing would be for alcohol, which is, I believe it's like 6 a.m. to 2 a.m., and wanted to make a strong distinction between a bar and a tap tasting room. So the opening time that we found of similar businesses was not before 11 o'clock, 11 a.m. So we decided to give the flexibility of 10 a.m. and then 10 p.m. is consistent with what we found with these types of businesses and also aligns with our entertainment policy.
Great. Thanks for that answer.
Other questions or comments? I just had one issue. I think it's a very small nit, but on the bottom of page 17, the last sentence says food service is not required for tasting rooms or taps. And I just wanted to raise the question with staff whether that should be made food service is possible but not required.
We could certainly make that change if that helps with clarity. I think in the end, it says the same thing, but if it's more approachable with that language, we certainly can make that change.
Okay, I appreciate that. So now entertain a motion. Oh, Commissioner Henson.
I actually did have one question that I thought it was what regard to what Ms. Summers brought up. I think what she said about coffee is that it would be a resolving process. But I just wanted to bring that up if there was any discussion that we needed to have around that. Because I can imagine that we went through a thing a few years ago where we had like a bunch of juice companies, cold pressed juice, and they even brought juices to the commission, and so you can get this herd effect. And so, do we need to worry about? I'm asking a question of the other commissioners. Do we need to worry about, or staff, about having too many coffee places?
So the coffee is actually captured under the specialty retail. So the next,
is that a separate category? I thought it was.
Are we doing those all under B?
I thought it was all under B.
Yeah, so I actually, if the commission will just indulge me for a minute, I spoke with the board president of the chamber at length yesterday, and we kind of walked through different stakeholder groups and what their position was on the coffee piece. And so I definitely, from a staff perspective, what we tried to do is present the commission with a very wide menu, really wide open. And as Mr. Foley and I started walking through some of the possibilities and some different things that have happened in the past, and I think what your Commissioner Hanson is referring to is just different cycles of businesses, and coffee seemed to be one that could be concerning. So right now a coffee house is a restaurant. Once you do something made to order, it becomes a restaurant. So when we were looking at this new specialty retail definition, we tried to align it with our traffic impact fee definition, which does include coffee. And what the concern was from the board president of the chamber is that when there's a public hearing, even though any coffee house could come in and apply for a conditional use permit through a restaurant and would likely, go through the process, there's still a public noticing. And so he felt like for the sake of some of our smaller coffee shops, having that public hearing was a peace of mind for them. And so I think that's where those comments from the chamber are stemming from. Is it's not like, oh no, we don't want any more coffee shops, or we're trying to say no juice or no this or no that, but there are some things that could throw off the balance. And so on one hand, we let the market control what happens, and then on the other hand, I think there is some preservation that Los Gatos has always come from, a place of preservation. So I do think that's where the concern came from, and it was definitely coffee specific. But I think that the commission could definitely talk a little bit about that definition and your comfort level with it based on how the chamber feels about that made to order piece being added being allowed by right.
No, but what you said was, for example, Great Bear is considered a restaurant.
Correct.
Okay.
So actually anything that makes something to order. So every ice cream shop, everything that you can walk up and specialize something is a restaurant.
Does that answer the question?
Yes, it sounded to me like there might be further discussion, but since people that have made to order foods are not part of this streamlined process, they would have to go through a process that another restaurant would.
Correct, which is the DRC. So specialty retail is a by right use, and it does not need a CUP, whereas a restaurant does. And so what we were looking at with this modification was to broaden the specialty retail definition and allow businesses that may have been restaurants before to now be a specialty retail, a frozen yogurt shop, for example. So it would really be the commission's purview to kind of look at that and see where you think that stop-start should be between a restaurant and a specialty retail, or if perhaps you think what the town has been doing works. That could also be a recommendation that's going to council. I just don't want to stand up here and advocate for something that I've heard very strongly from one of our biggest business advocates in town.
Other questions or comments? Commissioner Janoff.
So just to clarify, on page 20, we have a table, and the coffee shop or the coffee house is showing current code as a CUP and a DRC approval. The suggested amended use is specialty shop over the counter. And I just want to clarify, is what we're hearing tonight the recommendation that a coffee shop not be moved to a specialty use?
This is what we've heard from the chamber, correct? And
I'm just clarifying what the request is.
And so that's, I think, what Ms. Summers came forward and was asking is that particularly that coffee shop causes a pain point if we move it into the specialty retail category.
All right, thank you.
Further questions, comments? Motion? Oh, Commissioner Thomas?
I just have a question for fellow commissioners and staff, I guess, too. Just how is it possible for us to just how do we distinguish between, I guess, where do we draw the line? I mean, that's what Ms. Wren is saying that we need to decide. So, what type of business is considered specialty? Do we feel like is specialty food retail versus a full restaurant? Because I do understand right now, if there's any food prepared, it's a restaurant and everything is considered a restaurant. But we do need to be moving more options into specialty food retail shops so that smaller places can open, right? We need, we have a lot of ice cream, but we could always use more, Anyway, there's nothing wrong with that. But where do you all see as drawing the line? What type of food retail? And I don't know if you guys have some other definitions or where this was pulled from or what other towns have done. Any more information would be helpful.
I can offer a couple of things. First, the definition was sort of developed by looking at the two policies that are floating around with the town, the traffic impact policy and a director's policy, and in close consultation with Monica on the reality of the business community. Planning staff's not always, doesn't always have our ear to the ground with that. So it's very valuable to get that information. And then the second piece that I'd point out is just from a functional standpoint, if there's a particular category that you see listed here in this draft definition that you didn't want to include, we can specifically, instead of just removing it from the definition, we can specifically call it out that it is not considered specialty food retail or that it is still considered a restaurant. But we can take your direction and provide that.
Follow-up?
So I hear that in my brain, and this is for my fellow commissioners, what is the difference between coffee and, let's say, tea at the tea shops that are downtown versus really then what is the difference between the tea shops and the yogurt places? So that's what I want you guys to tell me. Thank you.
Commissioner Hanson, sir.
So I just want to ask a clarifying question. right, I'm looking again at page 20, and it says frozen yogurt shop, coffee house, and then specialty food retail shop offering alcohol for off-site or on-site consumption. So in the case of coffee house, if I understand what staff just said, that that the chamber was advocating for us not to include coffee houses, even though that was in the staff report this way. So a possible recommendation from us could be to say yes, because we're concerned about potential conflicts with the existing businesses. We would do everything except for coffee houses and leave coffee houses the way it is now, where they have to have a CUP.
That's
because
a
they're
potential motion, correct?
Okay, that's a potential outcome of this. Yeah.
Commissioner Raspy.
Thanks, Chair. I wanted to respond to Commissioner Thomas's comment. I think it's a good one. I think logically there is no difference between a coffee shop, a tea shop, a juice shop. And as I read the definition this past week, to me, it was a logical grouping that made sense to treat equally. That being said, it's clear that there's something more than words going on here. There's an economic impact that these words would ascribe to our community, and that specifically impacts the coffee houses. And so to me, the difference then is not the words, it's the result of those words. And so and I think we have to lean into our chamber, if the chamber believes that including the language in specialty foods has a deleterious impact on those businesses, then perhaps the best is to exclude coffee houses from specialty and proceed that way. Even though logically they're grouped together, the impact would result in something that as a town we don't want.
Thank you for that comment. Commissioner Janoff. You're right, I should be
I
sitting
said
down there.
before, I don't like this seating arrangement. Great question, Commissioner Thomas. I think if we were only looking at, kind of size of business, type of business, then there really isn't a difference. But I really appreciate the comments that Mr. Mullen has made regarding staff didn't know, so we checked with Economic Vitality, and Economic Vitality is checking with the Chamber of Commerce. This means experts are talking to experts about what we don't fundamentally know, because we're probably not shop owners of this nature. So while it may seem like it's an inconsistency to treat one type of what could be a specialty use differently, I think the economic arguments that have been presented to us tonight are compelling. We don't have juice makers or ice cream shops or other issues coming to us. It's just this one particular niche. And I think if we respect our community, want our community to continue to thrive, do what we need to do to ensure that that happens. So I'm comfortable making a motion that would remove the coffee house from this specialty use.
Okay. Other comments or questions? If not, that sounded like a motion. Oh, Commissioner Thomas.
I just want to ask staff that do we need any other justification other than we just want to do this? This isn't putting us like in legal jeopardy of being sued, because what's the difference between coffee and tea or something like that? Correct?
Well, unfortunately, we don't have our town attorney with us this evening, but this is a recommendation to town council as to what types of business you want to be seeing in different parts of town. One thing that I would, and I think you've already discussed it some, is that there may be some kind of tricky situations where somebody's got a juice shop but they want to serve coffee, or it's a tea house but we want to have coffee available, and how do we draw that line? And that's one of the things that staff would then have to work to implement. So it does make it a little less clear, but if that is the direction that Planning Commission wants to give, then that could be added as an exclusion from the definition of specialty food retail that's on page 19 of your staff report.
So as a follow-up to that, I think that just because this is a recommendation and just going to town council, that hopefully we can continue to reach out to the community and make sure there's not any other like categories that would feel particularly impacted, like coffee houses would be, because I wouldn't want them to, miss the opportunity and for our downtown character to be changed drastically, because we have some other longstanding businesses like you know, Dolce Spazio has been there for a very long time. I don't know if that would be a concern of theirs too. So I am comfortable and I'm happy that we had this discussion, but I would just, with forwarding this recommendation to town council, would just request that we investigate and make sure that coffee is the only one that should be switched.
If I may, so given the fact that the conversation that I had with the president happened so late in the game, it happened yesterday morning, I think before, or I can commit to you, before we go to the council, we will do some more discussions at the chamber. We can even invite in some of the businesses and have some conversations. Also do a little more benchmarking on maybe what some other communities do. We'll check in with our attorney. I hear those concerns and I share them. I think the number one thing that we were trying to reach was transparency with this one so that the community felt heard if all of a sudden we had a 5,000 square foot coffee house come in, right, that could afford that, because the majority of our small ones can't and don't. So it's really difficult because it really is a case by case and kind of an environmental issue, like what that issue is in that exact location. But I can commit to you that we'll do a little more background and research so that we have some more information when we get to the council. Thank you.
I'm looking for raised hands or a motion. Vice Chair Raspi.
I can try the motion again, if it's okay. With respect to the category bars, markets, and other miscellaneous commercial businesses, I move that we forward a recommendation to town council to accept and implement the changes noted by staff in the report, subject to the change in the definition of specialty food retail would not include coffee/tea houses. Point of clarification. Do you want to include a specific exclusion for, or just remove the language of coffee houses?
I'd defer to staff on that issue.
Could we just remove the language, or should we insert a specific exclusion?
Because there is an interest in not allowing coffee houses to use the specialty retail definition, we would recommend that be specifically excluded. My understanding from your conversation was that tea rooms or tea houses would still be maintained as part of it.
Thank you. Yeah. So let me, so again, forward the recommendation with the changes noted by staff as presented in the report, with the change of the definition specialty food retail to delete the phrase coffee in the phrase coffee/tea houses, and to insert language specifically excluding coffee houses from the definition of specialty food retail. And Chair, did you also have one additional change to add language?
I think Mr. Mullen gave me the answer I needed in terms of clarification, but thank you.
Very good. And as part of the motion, I will make the findings as set forth in the staff report.
Thank you for that complete motion. Commissioner Henson?
I'll second the motion, but I would ask if the maker of the motion would agree to request that staff do the additional research we discussed before going to council to make sure that we aren't creating a problem, unintended consequence.
Absolutely agree. Thank you.
Okay, and so we have a motion and a second. Any discussion? Seeing none, I'll call the roll. Commissioner Hanson?
Yes.
Commissioner Thomas?
Yes.
Vice Chair Raspi?
Yes.
Commissioner Burnett?
Yes.
Commissioner Janoff?
Yes.
And I vote as well in favor of the motion, and so it passes unanimously. Thank you for that. So forging ahead, we'll move on to item C, banks and financial and investment services. And I would open we're going to have public hearing on each of these items? Or it was already covered by the blanket at first? Okay. So I'll ask if there's any questions of staff on this matter, comments, or a motion. Not seeing any. Oh, I'm sorry, Commissioner Janoff. I'm going to switch places next time.
I feel so
Commissioner Stepp.
invisible. Thank goodness for Commissioner Thomas. I just wanted to point out the comment made regarding the bank definition of a bank. We had this robust conversation when we were considering Chase moving into the Gap space. I think it's a clear definition to include. It was the point that was the main issue of disagreement, is whether the Schwab was offering cash exchange or that kind of a service. And I think it's a good addition to add.
Other comments? I agree completely. That was a very hard decision to be made by the Planning Commission on the Schwab matter. Commissioner Hanson?
I was just, while you were talking, I was looking at the definition, and it does not specifically say cash per se. Well, it does not include payday lending businesses or check cashing, but I don't think people are even thinking about that. It was more about it like having an ATM. So I concur we should add that to the definition, that people would be able to withdraw cash, using ATM or other methods. Yeah.
Commissioner Thomas? Vice Chair Raspy?
Thank you. I think, ATM should somehow be incorporated within the definition of bank. My concern is ATMs are so ubiquitous now that they're in facilities that are not banks. They're in grocery stores. They're in just standalone kiosks. So my concern is if we expand the ATM, throw ATM into the bank definition, it might create issues.
You can help me with this too. Commissioner Janoff?
Thank you. I think the clarification to the definition I'm interested in seeing is ATM and cash, because certainly we don't want to be like a 7-Eleven that's got an ATM machine. So I think the notion that there has to be a person there whose function is as a clerk to distribute cash would be part of the change in definition.
Further comments?
Yeah, so I have, I was thinking like a teller also. I think that's what they're still called, right? Bank teller. But also I did have some questions about that, because I know that banks have really changed their hours of operation. Like Bank of America is not open a lot. The one, over at Blossom Hill and Los Gatos Boulevard. So, would that, I don't know how, is that just the trend that is happening? They have fewer and all of those bank retail locations are just not becoming a thing anymore. So if we add this definition, are we basically saying no more banks in town? Which, not that there's a problem with that, but is that what might possibly happen?
You bring up an amazing point. This is something that we've talked with the chamber quite a bit about, just how much real estate in general a bank takes up, and then how little interaction there is. So I think, and Mr. Mullen may want to expand on this, but I think what we're really trying to do is, with the absence of a definition of a bank, it caused some issues for us. So we can still have that conversation about what we want to do in general with banks and zoning at another time. But I think what we were trying to achieve here is that now we have a tool or a mechanism to say, yes, you're a bank, no, you're not. And then I think it's a much broader conversation, but you are right on, does it make sense to call it, is it appropriate, every other block downtown anymore or not? But I think this is really just giving us the opportunity to define it, and then they would go through the CUP process. So it doesn't allow it by right, it just defines it.
And so I do think that as a follow-up to that, I think that we would have to put in a minimum number of hours that they are available to the public, because if they're only open 1 hour a day for 1 day a week, by definition, they're going to be a bank. If they have a teller there 1 hour a day, 1 day a week, maybe, I don't know. So that's something, maybe not. But that I agree. Now I understand. And I do think that that's a good future discussion. So
I have a question for staff. So the benefit of the distinction between retail bank and financial services, although they have common features, would be that financial services would be in offices only in the C2 zone?
That's correct. As we saw during the Schwab debate, there was, with a lack of definition, we were relying on the applicant in that case to tell us what a bank was, essentially not having a code to fall back on. So we're not changing the regulatory framework for banks and financial institutions. We're just trying to draw a clear distinction between the two.
Understood. Okay, thank you. Commissioner Hanson.
I just wanted to add for clarity, because not everyone was on the commission when we had the discussion about Schwab. They were going to open in a very prime retail space on University, and they were posturing as if they would be accessible, you know, and then the questions were, well, could people just walk in? And then they were like hesitating a bit, you know, and then the question came up about whether or not they could, you know, someone could withdraw cash, and that Schwab is not that kind of organization. They don't aren't set up for that. So I think the way it's explained here on, you know, page 20, it says primarily focus on in-person and customer services such as deposits, withdrawals, loans, checking and savings, currency exchanges, mortgages, personal loans. That's not financial advisory like Schwab. I mean, so I think there's enough differentiation. If we add in including, you know, cash withdrawals on site, you know, that would add the one thing that you know, a lot of people would go to a bank for. I don't know what to think about the number of hours, but you know, maybe that's a bit broader discussion that's beyond this.
Commissioner Janoff, I see you.
Thank you. And I would agree that adding cash clarifies it in a way that we didn't have available before. And as far as hours of operation, you know, to me, that's a business model question. You might change banks if you're only open 1 hour a day, but you know, it's just I'm not sure that we're in the business of dictating the hours of the institution. But I would be comfortable adding cash, more than cash and ATM, but cash for sure.
I was going to ask the question about an ATM because I'm not sure I see ATMs inside a bank. They're frequently on the outside of the bank. So is that what we're talking about specifically?
I think it was more that you could get cash from the bank. I think it is a slippery slope with the ATMs because ATMs are everywhere. I mean, sometimes they're at gas stations. You know, they're in the grocery stores. They could be in the pharmacy. So I wouldn't consider any of those a bank. The definition has to be broader, that they offer a range of services, including cash withdrawals. We may not even need to mention the word ATM because a cash withdrawal is one service that can be performed in an ATM. You can do others. So I would just say cash withdrawals.
All right. Anything further? A motion, perhaps? Commissioner Hanson.
I will make a motion that we should forward a recommendation of approval to Town Council regarding the changes recommended in item C, and I can make the findings for CEQA and for the general plan, but that we should modify the definition of retail bank to include cash withdrawals in addition to the other items mentioned.
And a second? Commissioner Janoff.
Second.
Discussion on the motion? If not, I'll call the question. Commissioner, I'm sorry, Commissioner
Sorry,
Hanson.
just to clarify, so just put cash in front of deposit/withdrawals.
I think that's fine.
Okay.
Is that an amendment? No, a clarification, right? Okay, so we have a motion. Do we have a second? You already seconded, okay. Discussion? Don't see any. I'll call the roll. Commissioner Hanson?
Yes.
Commissioner Thomas?
Yes.
Vice Chair Raspy?
Yes.
Commissioner Burnett?
Yes.
And Commissioner Janoff?
Yes.
And I vote in favor of it as well, so it's unanimously approved. And we're making good progress, so why don't we move on to item D, which is on PDF page 21 of the staff report. And I'll ask if any of the commissioners have questions of staff on this matter, wish to comment on it, or make a motion. Yes, Commissioner Henson will start.
I asked a little bit of questions earlier because we also had gotten the letter in the addendum. A few years ago, maybe 5 years ago, we were asked on the Planning Commission, given the opportunity to attend a presentation on the future of retail. And, you know, as we've probably all familiar, it's been fairly bleak, and it's in the news every day about new retail locations that are closing. And I think we've been fortunate to keep as much retail as we've had in our downtown. And what's really happened in the last few years, I think it was mentioned by Ms. Summers and also by our economic vitality manager, that we have these businesses that come in like Sephora and Lululemon and whatnot. Those are draw businesses, and then people stay in town. And I think we have to think like that. And then the thing that people might be worried about, which would be like, is it Walmart going to come in and open up a huge thing? That we just don't have the real estate in downtown to make that happen. I don't think we have the retail space to do it anywhere in town, honestly. Maybe in the outlying parts of town, but in any case, I think that we should do everything we can to make it easy for businesses to be here, and retail businesses in particular. And removing the CUP requirement, I think, is just fine. And just simply by the amount of square footage we have and what's available, that it'll be a limiting factor to anything showing up.
Thank you for those comments. Any further questions or comments? Yes. Commissioner Thomas?
I just had a question for staff about if you know of how many retail spaces are vacant right now or that are larger than 6,000 square feet, I guess.
So specifically downtown, we have one. We have the former Williams Sonoma. We actually had a couple of formula retailers look at it, and they passed, and it wasn't, I don't know that if it was about the CUP or not. So there are other factors that people look at, when businesses look at when they come in. And then outside of downtown, we do have the former Rite Aid spot that's rather large that's open. And off the top of my head, I think those are the only two big spaces.
Whatever is across the street next to Lenardi's too, that was like
the Rite Aid, yeah.
No, the other right next door, like in between the bank. It's been nothing for a long time. It was like a Hallmark shop, but then before that it was like Doma. It wasn't Domus. Was it a Domus or really?
I do anticipate
that
there
place.
being
Okay.
some changes there, just given that there's a long-term land lease that's about to expire on that space, and so that may have something to do with the tenants and the turnover in the tenants.
Okay.
It's really interesting. The shopping centers function quite differently because there's one owner that has kind of an overview plan and idea, and then downtown we have an amazing group of owners, 150 or so, and so it's a little bit different to do kind of long-term planning, and that's, I think, leads to Ms. Summers' comment about it's harder to think about, we're just going to combine all these shops and it's going to become this massive superstore. It's just, that's less likely to happen downtown given the way it functions.
Okay.
Commissioner Burnett?
Thank you, Chair. So, a question with one of the comment letters that we did receive about the CUP, removing it, that we discussed, and of course our great Chamber of Commerce manager, the big muckety-mucker, what we would say at the Chamber of Commerce, but go on to say what he said basically was, yes, remove the CUP requirement for the neighborhood commercial and the restricted with the CH, but keep it in the central district and the LM, the commercial industrial. And the reason why he said, and it was an important point, and I wish to discuss this with the other council members, commissioners, that it would be an incentive for the business owners to help retain, the small businesses over, basically it would help with the owners of the properties. It would be an incentive. I don't know if there's a discussion on that or not. That could be a concern though, if you think about it.
Okay, I appreciate that
It
comment.
was- yeah.
Commissioner Jenna?
Yeah, I think the question was, what about the amendment that we received and the recommendation to keep big business or big bucks out of the downtown area. And I read that and I thought, good point. That's a really interesting point. However, the discussion tonight has been very compelling in terms of, wanting businesses to come into town and a limited number of sites that are that size anyway. So it's not going to be, it's not likely to transform the character of town. So I with all due respect to Mr. Mayor, who makes an interesting point, I'm listening to our persons who are much more tightly tied to business, and that outweighs that comment for me, and I think I'm in favor of what staff has recommended for that reason.
Thank you.
Respond to-
Commissioner Burnett.
Yes, I appreciate that, Mr. Janoff, and I agree with you. I just wanted to put that out as a question that was raised by Mr. Mayor, and I just wanted to address his concerns, but I do agree.
Other questions or comments? We had a brief discussion with Mr. Paulson yesterday in preparing for this meeting, and he brought to my attention that the formula retail restriction has not always been in place, and I was wondering if we had some notion of how long it has been in place.
I want to say, if I'm taking a guess, I want to say 04, but I could be off by a couple years. When I first started here, many decades ago, there was no distinction, but then there became a concern with the formula retail and that mix, and not wanting to upset that mix, specifically downtown. So it was implemented. And then even prior to the economic recovery agreement stage, we actually pulled back for everything less than 6,000 square feet. So it got modified at that point. And so now this is kind of that final step. And the other piece is not only this, but any other ones, because it's the same thing with personal service downtown. That used to be a permitted use. Then there was a concern that there's going to be a whole, all of downtown was going to be salons. We haven't seen that happen, but that's when that was put into place. And if any of these things, start becoming concerns moving forward, Ms. Wren, the planners, they're all going to keep an eye on that. And then we have another discussion with the council and see if we want to look at maybe pulling back from lessening these restrictions. So there is always that opportunity too.
Thanks for those comments, and I think that's good for us all to keep in mind. And so I think yes, Commissioner Thomas.
Thank you. I was just hoping that staff could tell us why 6,000 square feet is the number that's chosen.
That was the number that was chosen back in like 2004. So we had a distinction between formula retail under 6,000 square feet and then over. So anything over 6,000 needed a CUP anywhere, and anything under only needed the CUP in downtown. And that was the way to really preserve the mom and pop retail through the time. And I did want to add, when we removed the CUP for under 6,000 square feet, we did it for a 6-month, or I think it was like a year temporary basis. We came back to the council and said, we've gotten, none. Would you like to extend it? And they extended it again as a temporary basis. So this has now been in place since 2018. And just as we've done those quick kind of trials, we could definitely, if things start to unravel, come back to you and come back to the council and say, do you want to try a temporary in the other direction?
So we could temporarily require CUPs
Correct.
again. Okay.
And we have become kind of a leader in the Bay Area, because for a long time everyone was doing formula, and then the town pulled back. And so people have said, I get other cities who call and say, what happened? Did the sky fall? Is this okay? And so we've really, with this and with the parklets and with a lot of our streamlining, we've been out there as a leader in the Silicon Valley, and a lot of jurisdictions look to us for making these innovative changes.
Thank you. So I guess that at the end of this section, it does say, is there, specific types of formula retailers that should still require CUP? And along with that, should we discuss expanding it or forwarding with a recommendation to it being a higher number than 6,000 square feet? Because what I heard from the chamber is that it should be higher. What I'm hearing from what's happened, 6,000 hasn't like thus far, nothing has made a difference. So should that number be bumped up to 8 or 10,000?
Is there a comment from staff on that?
I'm not 100% sure. That's the first time that I've heard that comment, so I can't speak for the chamber. We really don't have any buildings that I can think of outside of like warehouses that are that big in town. It would really be something where someone combines them. Most of the time, if it's going to be a new development, you're going to hear about it anyways, and it's going to come before the Planning Commission and the council. This is really looking at a change of use, so something that exists and then a new user comes in. So you could certainly do that. You could also, I've heard in the past, people don't like formula defined as 7 or more. They like it defined more like 50 or more locations makes you a formula, or 100 or more locations make you a formula. So if that was a better level of comfort, that's also something you could consider. To be honest, when it comes to retail, there's just such a delicate balance between the synergy and the competition, and even in-person shopping in general, that a lot of this conversation has just become obsolete because those really big box retailers are online and they're looking for smaller footprints anyways. It doesn't make sense to occupy 10 or 12,000 square feet.
And the Williams-Sonoma is 6,800.
I believe it's something like that. It's
Okay.
not bigger than that. It's just over 6,000. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
I'll take Commissioner Janoff next.
Thank you. I would recommend we stick with the language we have because it's the language we've been using. These are the parameters we know. If we change more variables, we can't really measure in the same way what change might. We can't. Nothing to compare to. So you'll be changing something on top of something else. So I would recommend that we stick with the language that we've had. Open it up as recommended by staff and see what happens. And then, as staff has said, if it becomes a problem and it goes back to council or it comes back to the Planning Commission for any modification, then we'll see it then. But I like the idea of taking the historic language and carrying it through to the next logical step. See what happens, and then if another change needs to be made, we can do that.
Thank you for that. Commissioner Hanson and then Vice Chair Raspi.
Yeah, I just had a comment. If you look at what is being proposed here, that language is all going away. The word formula will be gone. 6,000 square feet will be gone. It's just going to be retail. And I actually, I given the dramatic changes in the retail landscape, I mean, we heard testimony years ago, from retailers here saying things like, people walk in our store, they go outside, go on the internet and buy it from somebody else. And we need to help these guys as much as we can. So I think we should do like Commissioner Janoff suggested, stick with the language here. I mean, if there's any discussion worth having, is there any business that we would want to exclude? I would advocate not to do that for the reasons I just outlined, but and then let the process go where it goes, and if it turns out we have unintended consequences, we can always pull things back.
Thank you. Vice Chair Raspi.
Thank you, Chair. Just one point, and it's the last point that Commissioner Hanson's making on whether we should have any uses which we don't want we still want some limitation on. The one that's noted in our report is perhaps, by way of example, alcohol sales. Do we want to allow without a CUP large alcohol sales? I know we've had, for instance, Bevmo just opened up. I don't know how big the Bevmo space was, but it seems to me that at least we should consider, maybe that's a discussion we want to have about, that's an area we may want to limit without the CUP. But just, if you can let me know how big the Bevmo space is, do we know?
Well, I can add it. I'm not sure how large the Bevmo space is, but I will add with the specifics to alcohol. The changes as proposed in here would not remove the CUP requirement for any business that wants to sell alcohol for on-site or off-site. The discussion point added here was really about if there's this further control for these formula over 6,000 that sell alcohol. So if this gets adopted and incorporated into the town, BevMo would still require a CUP simply because the existing conditional use table requires a CUP for off-site sales of alcohol or on-site sales.
Perfect. So instead of belts and suspenders, we have now belts or suspenders, but we're still protected from.
Alcohol would still require a CUP. It may have not been the best example provided for a discussion point in the
helps
staff
quite a bit.
report, but
Thank
happy
you
to
very much.
clarify.
Yeah.
Any further questions or comments on D? If not, I'm looking for a motion from the commissioners. Commissioner Henson.
I will make a motion that we should recommend to council to adopt the changes under D that are mentioned in the staff report on page 22, and I can make the findings that accordance with CEQA, and also that this is in compliance with the general plan, and no changes recommended from what's in the staff report.
Thank you for the motion. Is there a second? Commissioner Thomas.
I second.
Any discussion? If not, I'll call the roll, beginning with Commissioner Henson,
Yes.
Commissioner Thomas,
Yes.
Vice Chair Rusby,
Yes.
Commissioner Burnett,
Yes.
and Commissioner Janoff.
Yes.
And I vote yes as well. It passes unanimously. So we're making good progress. We have E and F to complete. And E concerns group classes in the C2 zone. And I wonder if commissioners would like to make any comments on that matter. Specific issue, maybe there's no discussion required. If not, I'll ask for a motion on item E, please. Commissioner Raspy.
Thank you. I have no comment, and hearing no comment from my fellow commissioners, I would make a motion that with respect to group classes in the C2 zone, we forward a recommendation to town council to accept and incorporate the changes recommended by staff as set forth on page 13 of our staff report, and I would additionally make the findings as required.
Thank you for the motion. Second, Commissioner Janoff. I'll second. Discussion, Commissioner Hanson.
I just wanted to mention, since I was on the commission, when all this, these group classes started, and now there's multiple cycle places, there's Pilates, Bar A and whatnot. So when we had the cycle place on Santa Cruz, it was a really long planning commission discussion, and ultimately it got approved. But I mean, when you consider the retail environment, we have to encourage things that bring people downtown. And so those are the kinds of things that bring people downtown. And then that was sort of when the juice companies started coming in, and they would go to the juice place next door. So this is all good harmonic things that are happening. So I just wanted to just give my vote of encouragement before we voted, and why. So
Great. Thank you. So we have a motion and a second. Is there any further discussion? If not, I'll call the roll. Commissioner Hanson,
yes.
Commissioner Thomas,
Yes.
Vice Chair Raspy,
Yes.
Commissioner Janoff,
Yes.
Commissioner Burnett,
Yes.
and I vote yes as well. So that matter passes unanimously as well. And we're getting to the end. Item 4, veterinarians in the C1 zone. And I'll call for any questions or comments on that item. I'm not seeing any. So why don't we move ahead with the motion? Please. Commissioner Raspy. Oh, Commissioner Thomas, excuse
Sure.
me.
I
Would like to hear
move
from you.
to forward the recommendation for item F, veterinarians in the C1 zone, as and stated in the staff report. I can make the findings, required findings, and recommendations in the staff report.
Thank you for that. We'll look for a second. Commissioner Burnett.
I second that.
Any discussion? Seeing none, I'll call the roll again. Commissioner Hanson,
Yes.
Commissioner Thomas,
Yes.
Vice Chair Raspy,
Yes.
Commissioner Burnett,
Yes.
Commissioner Janoff.
Yes.
And I vote as well in favor of the motion, so it passes unanimously. And let me see. Sorry? Yeah, we'll confirm that there's no appeal rights on this matter since this recommendation.
That is correct. Since it's a recommendation to town council, there are no appeal rights.
And the findings have been made on each of the separate motions, so I think we're in good shape there. So I would be my inclination to call for a break unless the commissioners want to move forward at this time on the next item? We're good. Okay. I like the spirit. So we'll move on to agenda item 3. Which is also a request for a recommendation to the town council, this time on modification to the town, I would call it pole height and netting policy for additions and new construction. And the proposed amendments to the town policy are not considered a project under CEQA. And I'll ask if staff has a presentation on this matter.
Yes, good evening, Chair, Vice Chair, Commissioners. The item in front of you is consideration of changes to the town's height pole and netting policy, often referred to as the story pole policy. This discussion was requested by Town Council as part of recent discussion of requests for exceptions to the current story pole policy, as well as being included as an implementation program in the current draft housing element. This was expected to be a work plan for discussion by Council Policy Committee, but they directed staff to move forward and bring the discussion to Planning Commission for consideration and recommendation to Town Council on what changes might be warranted. Based on previous discussion with Town Council, as well as outreach to story pole installers, architects, and developers in town, the written staff report includes several topics for discussion, including projects over 35 feet in height, guy wires, particularly when the story poles are close to property lines, projects with multiple buildings, interference with existing residents and businesses, and the exception process. These items are intended to initiate tonight's discussion, but we also invite questions and recommendations for other modifications. This concludes staff's presentation, but I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you for that report. And questions from the commissioners or staff? Mr. Henson.
We received a comment letter in the addendum, and it was about, one of the items mentioned was about having to submit a story pole plan preceding implementing the story poles. And it's mentioned in the staff report that we have, that there are certain jurisdictions in Santa Clara County that have do not have story pole requirements and other ones do. Do most people that have story pole policies require a story pole plan, or is it, or do they leave it to the experts to implement it?
Thank you for that question. I don't have that level of detail on the other policies that other municipalities have. It does seem to vary significantly from one community to another as to how they implement this requirement. In some cases, there is a written policy that's available online. In other cases, it is just a staff policy that is required as part of processing these projects, and the types of projects that they apply to also varies from one community to another. So we saw a wide variety of that.
Okay, thank you for that. It was probably more information than I would have expected that you would have. But my question is, I wanted to add on to that question and ask that why, when we do these view corridor things, you know, outside people do the view corridors, and when we do a CEQA, we get an outside company to do the CEQA. So why do we require a story pole plan? I mean, it wasn't on the list of discussion topics, but when I saw the letter, it did make me think, what would happen if we didn't do that?
Thank you for that question. I would say that taking a look at the introduction to the current story pole policy is very helpful in understanding the purpose behind having a policy like this. It emphasizes two primary purposes. One is to show the size and massing of the proposed buildings or renovation, and the second is to call attention to the proposed project for public involvement. And so based on that language, I would say that those are the goals. There are other ways to address those particular issues, signage, and then simulations or other types of flagging, for example, some of the examples that were provided in the staff report. Did that answer your question?
No.
Okay.
What I was asking was,
Clarify.
it's not about whether they do story polls or not. It was specifically about having to submit a written story poll plan prior to putting up the story polls. Why do we
Why do we-
require that? Yeah, I mean,
I see.
what would happen if we didn't require that step in the process?
Well, based on my experience in looking at story poll plans, it's often helpful for staff to be ensuring that there are polls representing the massing of the building in compliance with the story poll policy. But in general, if a lot of the times the certification that we receive states that the story polls are consistent with the proposed plans. So I think there is room for that type of modification if the Planning Commission is supportive of that. And then I want to check in with our Community Development Director to see if he has any other further thoughts on that.
Yeah, and I would just say, just for discussion, the potential implication is we don't have a plan. They put up polls. We go out and look at them and say that doesn't work. Modify them. We still don't have a plan. They modify them. Still doesn't meet what we want. So the plan really is, here's the plan, put them up, and there we go. So that's the other side of it for the potential implications.
Okay, that's good for now.
Yes, Commissioner Burnett?
Thank you, Chair. So I feel that our story poll policy has served us very well since 1998. I think it's very important for the citizens to have story polls. Oh, it's questions for staff?
Yes, please.
Oh, I don't have a question for staff, although maybe one. A 35-foot tall building, what, for an example, how high is 35? Just because we keep talking about 35 feet and the wind and how that affects at 35 feet. So, I'm not, how tall is 35? If we're looking, can you give me an example?
What I would say is that in many areas in town, residential or commercial, the maximum height currently is 30 or 35 feet. And so that gives you a sense. In downtown, the maximum height is 45 feet.
Oh.
We do have properties that exceed those height limits in some cases. But if you think of the housing that you see around town, if it's a 2-story house, it's often between 28 to 35 feet, sometimes a bit smaller.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions of staff? I have a question. I should know the answer to this, but are story polls required if there are added roof elements to a single or second-story house that do not affect the massing?
If there are roof elements that don't affect the massing, that based on that description, I would say that no, story polls would not be required. We do occasionally have additions to an existing 2-story home where the addition would change substantially the massing of that second story. It may only be requiring a minor residential development application and so wouldn't be going to a public hearing, but that we would request the story poles be installed. Also, if it's a brand new second story on an existing single-story house, we do require them for those.
Understood. Thank you. Other questions? Commissioner Rusby.
Thank you, Chair. A question for staff. Just anecdotally, have there been problems with the orange netting versus any other type of material that we can use for story polling, for instance, the pendant flagging or any others? I know we went through a period of very high wind and weather in the past several months. I'm curious as to, just again, in your experience, have those particular materials proved more problematic than others, for instance?
Thank you for that question. Yes, as you will see in the comments from the story pole installers, there is concern when you go over 30 or 35 feet, especially if it's in an area where it will be catching the wind, that can cause hazards. For those taller poles when you use the netting. There didn't seem to be concern with using the flagging instead. This was the source of the recent story pole exception requests, that because there were taller buildings involved in the Wood Road project and then in the Winchester Road project that will be coming forward to you in the coming months, there were concerns, and so a request for an exception to the story pole policy did go to town council. And so that is where we got this discussion of, should we include a specific exception that if it's over a certain height, they be allowed to do some alternative method.
Thanks very much.
Other questions? So we'll move on to discussion among the commissioners. Oh, I'm sorry, we have a card from Ms. Wiersman. If you come forward, please. I'll open the public hearing.
Hi, Bess Worsima, Studio 3, but I'm not here for just me. I'm here for representing Gary Colsat, Tony Jeans, Tom Sloan, Jennifer Crutcher, Louie Liu, Noel Cross, and Jay Plett. After Jennifer sent the notification out about the story pole potential revisions or discussion, or whatever we're calling this, we did all get together because I think one thing that I can say we all have in common is we strongly disagree that story poles are helpful. We actually believe they are more hurtful and that they are an outdated method for displaying and explaining a project. We live in a time where people can do 3D models and can pin them to a height requirement or to a pole and then turn those in, and they're going to actually show the finished product of what a project looks like. They're not going to be ugly, orange, flapping poles that deer run into, bicyclists run into, kids run around, get torn down, etc. I think all of us would agree that if someone built a house that looked like something that was story poled, none of us would like that house. And yet that's exactly what story poles convey. They do not convey anything that exists in the character of how we are supposed to design homes as architects. Massing can be better seen in 3D models and visualization and should be allowed to be an exception unless a project is highly contested or needs to go to Planning Commission. I think these are all things that you guys would find to be actually more useful in terms of creating neighborly conversation between houses and their built environment, changes in their built environment, and also are more realistic. I want to remind you that story poles that sit in hillside don't show things like retaining walls, terrace hillsides, the other grading that occurs on the site that creates a finished product in the end. And so often the interpretation of what we are considering massing is really irrelevant to actually what it is in the long run. We do have a concern about the way story pole plans are reviewed in town. No other jurisdiction locally that we do have story poles go up in has a review process that's as significant as the one here in Los Gatos. The one in Los Gatos is time consuming, requires more rounds of revisions, and in an effort to try to streamline the process, we just respectfully ask that, trust the professionals that are putting them up and putting a certified letter together for you. We don't need to build a whole house out of pickup sticks and netting. And then lastly, I do want to correct something. We do get required to put story poles up on existing second homes, even for things like dormers, because while there's the option that we can maybe ask for an exception, often the exception is not granted. I have several projects of my own that I could speak to, and I know that the architects all have others too, because that was one of the reasons we wrote some of those bullet points in there saying, hey, if we're adding dormers to an existing second-story house, yes, dormers can change some of the massing, but they're really not changing the big overall footprint and mass of the home. So we often, even on a minor res application, are required to do story poles. These just add more time, more expense. A basic story pole package, including plans, for a regular new home in Los Gatos costs about $20,000. I'm sure we'd all rather spend $20,000 on beautiful architectural details, especially if the house is not contested by neighbors and meets the design guidelines.
Thank you. Well, let's if there are questions for you from the commissioners. I'm not seeing any, so thank you for that. Ms. Sums?
Great. I'm Catherine Summers again with the Los Gatos Chamber of Commerce. And this is really kind of a big topic, but I would start with saying that houses at the end of the day are not orange and they're not see-through. And I think that Bess kind of stated it correctly, that story poles are something that we used to always rely on, but now there are so many other tools. With that said, I do actually still believe that we need to come up with other ways of engaging the public, perhaps, so that they can go and utilize those other tools that are available. However, going back to the story poles, I do think that they are truly causing impediments. And I'm really here representing a lot of my members, again, at the Chamber of Commerce, who are architects and builders and who have been really frustrated with this process as of late. And I'm hoping that you'll consider tonight coming up with other options so that they can work through these building processes more quickly and efficiently, because it really is causing some strain and concern, not only on the part of the architects and the builders, but also on the homeowners themselves. It's also causing constraints on the building department themselves, because we're spending a lot of time on some of these residential homes that really are pretty easy, maybe, and then we have a lot of commercial projects also. So I think we need to alleviate some of that stress from our building department, if that's at all possible. That's one other point. And then the last one, I've watched Planning Commission deliberate over some of the story poles and what it looks like to you. Again, those orange story poles that are see-through. And I think the architects in particular are professionals, and they've gone to school for this for years and years. And sometimes when they're talking about 2 feet versus 3 feet, or an indent here, an indent there, I think we really have to learn to give them to accept and acknowledge that they know what they're talking about. And so I think if they're saying right now that the story poles are obsolete and there's other ways of sharing with the public what their beautiful designs will look like, then they should be able to do it that way. There will still be opportunities for you to say, nope, that doesn't fit the character, or no, that's too high. But I just think that the story poles aren't really telling that story anymore. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Summers. Are there questions from commissioners for you? No? Thank you very much.
And Chair,
Yes.
we do have a speaker that is on Zoom who would like to speak.
Thank you very much for bringing that to my attention.
So I'm going to allow Don Capobres to speak. Go ahead. You have 3 minutes.
Good evening, Chair Barnett, Commission, and staff. I really wish I was there in person. My name is Don Capobres with Harmony Park Development. I've worked on the North 40 project for over 15 years. In the context in which we were required to implement it, the town story pole policy is an anti-housing development tool. In his February 10th comment letter to the town's draft town's draft housing element, which was sent to HCD, our attorney Eric Phillips stated, requiring story poles creates unnecessary tension within the community and can create false expectations about the town's ability to deny or modify design elements such as height or massing that are consistent with the town's development standards. For example, during phase 1 of the North 40 development, acres and acres of unsightly story poles stirred enough angst among community members to temporarily derail the approval process. However, given that the phase 1 development and many other housing developments are protected by state laws that prevent the town from denying or reducing the density of housing development projects, including the Housing Accountability Act, the State Density Bonus Law, the story poles do nothing more than create unnecessary opposition to projects that are legally entitled to move forward. Said simply, the town's outdated story pole policy is impeding housing production. We will continue to voice this sentiment to HCD and other decision makers as long as policies such as this remain in the books. The town must allow simpler, less burdensome, and more effective ways of providing notice and information, such as large informational signs posted on site and using 3D renderings, fly-through videos, and other technological methods that convey similar information without unreasonably burdening development projects. This is especially true as to meet the town's housing needs, it will have to allow for taller buildings with heights that make the town's current story pole policy technically infeasible to implement. Further, unless members of the public are invited to walk the interior of a private property, and although we did invite some officials on site in phase 1, there is no requirement to do so. Story poles can only be seen from public right-of-ways, making understanding the context of a larger proposal increasingly challenging. I do have specific data regarding costs and logistics on the story pole exercise for phase 1 on the North 40, and I'm happy to share if you have any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kumpers, and I'll ask if any of the commissioners have questions for you. Okay, I'm not seeing any. Thank you very much. And we have no further speakers on Zoom. If there's no further discussion by the commissioners, I'll call for a motion. Sorry?
Through the chair, once you have closed the public hearing, then
Yes.
we would go back to discussion with the commissioners.
Thank you. I omitted that. So we will close the public portion of the public hearing and now ask commissioners if they have further questions for staff, comment on the request, or propose a motion. Commissioner Hanson.
This is sort of a question for staff. As I read the staff report, it looked to me like this was a substitute for a policy committee meeting in the form of a planning commission. So what I thought we were supposed to be doing is taking the topics, for example, projects over 5 feet in height. There's a question at the end, should modifications maybe be made to allow 1 or 2 rows of flagging for buildings over 35 feet in height? So what I thought we were going to do is that similar to what we did with the last item, where we would discuss each one of these items. And then I think what we're trying to do is make a recommendation to council on ideas, concepts for the story pole policy to go back to council or the policy committee, or I'm not sure. But so that's my question is, you know, am I on the right track, and what is staff hoping for out of this?
Thank you for that question. Yes, we did structure this staff report similarly to the last item with subtopics of interest. This is not quite as fully developed in terms of direction or recommendation from staff, since there are a number of topics that could have a number of different solutions. And so looking for some initial direction from Planning Commission for staff to develop some additional details, or if the Planning Commission finds that they have specific recommendations that they feel comfortable making at this time to Town Council, we can do that as well. So on each of these items, I think it will depend on whether the Planning Commission feels they have sufficient information to make suggested changes in which we could then take forward to Town Council, or whether there's additional information or input that you are looking for.
And then a follow-up question. Nowhere in the staff report is there a discussion topic saying, should we or should we not have a story pole policy? Are you wanting us to have that discussion as well?
As I stated in my presentation, we would welcome any discussions, whether the story pole policy, which we have heard, interest in maintaining, but maybe that is the recommendation of the Planning Commission about whether we should have one at all, or whether it should be modified, and if modified, then in what ways.
Commissioner Thomas. Withdraw the question. Commissioner Burnett.
Yes, not a question for staff, but I could make my own comments.
Please, go ahead with your comments.
So I think instead of talking for architects and builders, I'm talking for the citizens of Los Gatos, I feel. And I think story poles have served us actually very well since 1998. We've had this policy moving forward, and as I say, I think it's It's an important policy, and I think story polls are important. And I think people in general are made aware of a project, and that could affect their the project. How could it could affect their view? It could affect the light. It could affect the streetscape. When you see story polls, I mean, you get a good feeling of what's going to be there. And I think that's important. When you're driving by, you see, oh, that's going to be coming up. And they say, well, videos and photos and whatever. People aren't going to be looking at videos, and they're not going to take the time to do that. You want to see what's going to be built. You want to get a feeling for it. You want to see if mountains are going to be hidden, or so I mean, there's so many different concerns. And then comments were made, well, other towns are no longer using story polls. Well, if you look at the towns that they suggested, these are big towns. We're Los Gatos. We're a small town. You're impacted more. So I think it's more important to know what's happening in the town. And I think they're especially important in the hillside. I mean, that was interesting. I really want to see what's happening on my hillside. I want to see those story polls. And then, so I would make suggestions that maybe we could streamline the permit process to make it easier and try and cut costs for the builders. I'm sympathetic to that. So maybe that could be one area. We could look at the buildings that are very high, over 35 feet, and maybe think of flags, different colored flags. I know there was an issue with 2 sets of flags, and maybe it's because they're the same color. Maybe that was an issue that why they couldn't be seen. And then, let's see, what else was I going to say? And then there was the idea of putting your poles, if the property line is, you can move it, what did I say? Put the poles inward on the property, so that, because I know there was an issue about where you put the poles. So maybe that could be another, I know that was an issue, but in general, I think the citizens of Los Gatos like story poles, and I think we should, personally, I feel we should keep them, and maybe with some suggestions for small changes and adjustments. Thank you.
Thank you for those comments. Commissioner Thomas?
Are we going to, I guess I have a question for you, Chair. Are we going to go through each of these projects, or do you want us to first just give our generic overview, or should we go through each of the items as recommended for the discussion and direction by staff? On
going
page
through
62.
A, B, C, and D, and E and F.
So should we go through by, are we doing
yeah.
through by order or no?
Why don't we proceed in that way?
Okay.
Yeah, suggested by Commissioner Hanson.
So I guess that I then
We'll
have
start
a
with-
question
we'll
about
start with A on projects so exceeding 35 feet.
Yes, so can I ask a question about
Please.
that? Okay, so my question is just for what are, I don't know if you can answer this, but what are the options and the cost difference for things that are different for projects over 35 feet in height?
Thank you for that question. I don't have information specifically about the cost. I think it varies significantly on the different types and complexity of projects. The height of the poles is one of a number of factors that affects the cost. Also, the time that they are up and whether they need repair, for example. And so that's one of the concerns when they do become taller. The main recommendation for an alternative for those taller poles was the use of flagging instead of the netting. And then is there another height beyond which it's just not reasonable to use poles at all, but that alternative methods might be considered, or the complexity. As we're going through these different topics, I think that's very useful, but I would also say that we want to make sure at the end of the discussion to consider whether there are other topics that have been brought up by the commenters. For example, the idea of additions to single-family homes or new single-family homes, should those be excluded completely or under certain categories? So there definitely are additional topics in addition to what was listed in the staff report.
Can I follow up? with
Please.
that? Okay, so I feel like I do think that, you know, the requirement of the 2-foot netting is problematic, and we all know why. And so I do think that flagging is a good alternative, but I also feel like we should explore as a town other alternatives besides just story poles for some situations, and mainly to also compare like the costs to, you know, that if it could streamline anything for town staff, but also the cost to developers and everything, because we know that we don't want this to be, I mean, $20,000 maybe to a large developer building a lot of housing isn't a lot, but we don't want this to be an impediment to, you know, meeting our arena requirements.
Thank you. Any other comments on A? Commissioner Janoff?
Yeah, this may not be a popular approach, however, I'm in favor of everything that the staff is recommending in A through F. However, we've heard some really compelling information tonight. I'm not sure whether the staff has had the opportunity to work with the architects who have brought forward the amendment of April 21st. Thank you, sir. Let me start over. I'm in favor of all the changes staff has recommended, A through F, but I think it misses larger points that the architects have raised, as well as others in the community. I do think story poles serve a purpose, but I think it is a strange purpose. For me, they generally represent height, and that's about it. And as the testimony has come forward tonight, if the height is within our zoning code, then why would we have the flags or the netting or whatever it might be? Because that's not a contestable thing. Now, we ask for netting or we ask for story poles specifically when you're asking for an exception, right? So it's higher than. This was the case on Ms. Waresmith's project. And so we thought it was very important that the neighbors see, okay, well, I'm here and that's where it's going to be, and yeah, we think 3 feet makes a difference. So when there's an exception being asked for, I think it makes sense. We also, I guess I didn't realize that story poles are required for everything, not everything, but not just projects that go to the Planning Commission, but for projects decided by staff. I think it's really important that we do use the tools of the 21st century or whatever. There's so many great modeling tools. And I would say even that model that we had of the North 40 that sat out in the lobby of the Civic Center for a long time was an interesting tool. Miniaturized wasn't helpful in terms of seeing its overall impact, but we have such great tools with rendering software and the capabilities of our experts that those should be considered as a requirement, perhaps over story pools. I have an issue with the plans being required when we've got the story pools, when they are required, being certified and installed by experts. So in short, we got a lot of really good information in the amendments and the comments, and I think that input isn't reflected in the 6 topics that we are being asked to talk about. It just seems like there's some bigger, broader issues. I would be curious, and I don't want to monopolize forever, but you know, we talk about the issue of story poles came up most recently when we were talking about the housing element and the negative impact or the governmental barrier it has on developing housing. It may be different, $20,000 when you're developing a single family residence is one thing, but if your story poles are going to be really complicated if you've got a more complex, larger structure. So that's going to be a significantly greater cost. And if that's an impact, a negative impact on the town's ability to see housing getting developed, I think we really have to think about that too. So for me, this isn't covering as much, this is, what staff is recommending is okay, but it doesn't cover sort of the larger conversation. I feel like we need a second recommendation from staff having gone through what we're hearing from the experts.
So I noted that in the alternatives presented on page 20, where are we, 65? That included a possible motion to continue the matter to a certain date. Commissioner Hanson?
I was going to go exactly there. After listening to the discussion and considering the input from the architects, I think it would be worthy to continue this to have a more broader discussion, because I think the fundamental issue has to start with whether or not we have story poles and under what circumstances, and then these things that are listed in the staff report are kind of details and specific cases of story poles, and I think there's a bigger discussion. I did want to also add that as Commissioner Janoff noted, this did come up in the housing element discussion, but I will say that when we discussed it briefly at the housing element meeting back about a month ago, Councilmember Hudis spoke very passionately about the importance of story poles and how he would never, on his watch, let that happen. That they would go away. That they're the thing that our residents have to hold on to with all this new building. And he's only one person that's speaking. So it is a very controversial topic, and I think it's worthy of having the whole picture to discuss, and maybe we don't have that right now.
Let me start with Commissioner Thomas, then I'll go to Commissioner Janoff.
I agree that I think some points were brought up, and I feel like I would like to be able to do some more looking around at what other districts have done for options and changing requirements and everything like that. So I do think that it would be helpful to do that, but I think that it would be also helpful to staff to tell them exactly what we want more information on for a further discussion. So that would be my recommendation. And one of the things would be like specifically looking at some certain like the projects and language from some of these other locations where story poles are and are not required. And specifically, I'm very interested in the like Los Altos versus Los Altos Hills, because I think that like Los Altos Hills is in the hills and Los Altos is not, and one removed and the hillside area didn't, and we have both those spaces. So is this, what might that look like at on a policy level for maintaining some of that in areas that are in our hillsides? Like we have we have different requirements for stuff. So that is, okay. Thanks.
So we don't have a motion to continue yet, but maybe one is developing. Ms. Armour?
Thank you. I would definitely ask that we get specific direction as to what additional information the Planning Commission needs to further this conversation. As previously stated, we invite you to talk about topics that weren't listed in the Planning Commission report. In the written staff report, we included some topics, but not even specific recommendations, just ideas that we had heard. And we received additional ideas in the public comment, and those are worth discussing as well. So that should not stop the commission from discussing those questions in whatever order or fashion works for you. If there are specific questions about other agencies' story pole policies that I could answer now, I do have a number of those here in front of me. In terms of, for example, the City of Los Altos did just remove their policy. They don't require it. The town of Los Altos Hills, however, does have a policy, and they require it for new buildings, second-story additions exceeding 900 square feet that increase the roof height, etc. I could go through the full list. But if there are particular questions, I may be able to answer some of that, or if there are particular topics that you can include in discussion tonight, and then really narrow in on what additional information staff can provide for further discussion.
Commissioner Espy?
Thank you, Chair. I think it makes perfect sense to continue this discussion with specific direction to staff. And before, I actually wanted to join almost 100% with all the comments that Commissioner Janoff said. I came from Los Angeles before I lived here. And one of the things you first notice as you come into town are story poles. We don't have those in Los Angeles. And I think they serve a purpose. I think they help you, as Commissioner Burnett noticed, you visualize sight lines that you don't get from renderings. That being said, it's also my view that you don't need them for every project. And we can certainly, I think, start moving towards a more 21st, 22nd century use of technology. The renderings, I think, are going to be great. The problem with that is not every one of our citizens, I think, is ready to use all those tools. And so I don't think we can today jump to just renderings as opposed to story poles. But I think as a town, we should start moving there. So what I would like to see as part of our further discussion is perhaps a discussion of what technology is available and who's using it. I would also like a discussion, as Commissioner Janoff indicated, should we be using this only when variances are sought, or if only, and perhaps not use them if everything is in, if no variances are sought, everything is built pursuant to code, what's the use essentially of the story poles? And then maybe perhaps thirdly, a discussion of commercial versus residential uses of story poles. Should there be a distinction in those applications? One certainly applies more directly to business, but I guess they both do, since they both impact architects and builders. But off the top of my head, those are the areas I think I would like to see a little bit further information from staff. So thank you.
Any other specific recommendations to staff? Yes, we'll start with Commissioner Burnett.
Thank you, Chair. So, you know, I would see that we could have exceptions to story poles, that some large projects, maybe like the North 40, where there's very specific plans. You have the density, the intensity, the height, the massing is pretty well talked about, documented. And so it's not a huge surprise, I think, to the town or town people driving by that area that know this is coming about, this is going to be part of Los Gatos. There could be a model down at the council chamber like they had previously. Of course, it didn't turn out looking like that, but it would still be available. So I could see there would be, you know, structures that wouldn't need story poles. Where I think story poles are so important are neighborhoods and downtown area, where there's a lot of vitality and a lot of communities, activities going on. So I could see where we could have exceptions to story poles, which would help with the building costs for the, you know, the large projects. And, you know, like the North 40, I would think that could work. So, you know, there's options. I think we can meet in the middle and get all our needs met. Thank you.
Thank you. Other comments or suggestions? Commissioner Janoff, yes.
Thank you. I would be, you know, Councilmember Hudes makes an interesting point, and he is one voice, one vote. However, without alternatives, that's probably where most people would land, right? So I'd be interested in understanding why the other municipalities in the county have eliminated their requirement for story poles. Was that a recent thing? Are they tied to the housing element and the whole barriers thing? In particular, who was it that Los Altos on February 14th? I'm assuming that was related to the, yeah, right. So they probably got a comment back from HCD and said there's a barrier to remove. I also think that the letter alone from the group of architects has a number of points that could be discussed. In particular, the last 7 or so: no single story home, no single story addition, no story poles required if there are added roof elements that don't change the overall height. Simplified to show in the main ridges. You know, part of the problem that I have with story poles sometimes is that you're seeing so many poles representing different peaks of different elements, and some of the homes that are architected are so interesting in their roof lines. You get a lot of mixed up sight lines, so you really don't see. So I think that there's a list here that's a good list to start from in terms of grouping what would be excluded and what might not be excluded for purposes of discussion going forward.
Thank you. Other specific recommendations for staff investigation? Commissioner Thomas?
I have a list of questions and comments. Basically, the first one is just what are the main alternative options to story poles especially for single family homes? Like some of these suggestions that were listed, additions, remodels, and just new development. And then how can we best ensure that the story poles don't impede our housing element plans from moving forward, because we know that that's a concern and it's going to be hard for us to get that stuff done. So we don't want to just add extra trouble for ourselves. And then is it legal, or are we allowed to only require story poles when variances are requested? And then can we align some of the story pole requirements or alternatives to story poles requirements with where would we, if we are going to make distinctions between things, would it be about density? Would it be about number with regards to housing? Would it be with number of units, or lot size, or FAR, or what is the defining thing that would say okay, this triggers story poles going up because this is considered a big project? Right now we we see projects that are asking for variances, or it's the biggest house in the neighborhood, or it's a new this in the neighborhood, etc. Right? So what would kind of trigger the story poles maybe needing to be put up for some specific projects? What are the parameters, and how might we best go about that in a way that is streamlined and easy for everyone to understand? And then how can we still make sure, because I think that this is really the concern that everyone is talking about, and what Councilmember Hudes is I think that one of his main concerns is how can we still make sure that neighbors know that construction's going to happen, that things are going to be torn down, that new stuff's going to be built or added on, without what alternatives are there to these big ugly things that do often scare people, and that don't also follow up by looking at the plans and as in much detail as we maybe do. So how can we really make sure that people are still aware that projects are happening? Because I think that is a lot of people's main concern, because it is true. It's I walk around in my neighborhood on a walk with my dog or my friends, and I see, orange poles, you know what I mean? I that triggers this is happening. And I'm aware of what's going on in town. So I do think that is the concern. I think that's a concern. How do we flag something so that neighbors and people walking by know in a way that is not quite as egregious as a story pole, but is better than just a small sign in front of someone's house? So where does that happen? And then, yes, so that is it. And then my last question is the legality of looking at the distinction between hillside areas and not. Is that something that would be easy for us to distinguish between, or would staff or the town attorney recommend that it needs to be a more blanket policy with regards to all housing, and a different policy for commercial, etc.? I know, I'm sorry, that was a lot. Jennifer's okay.
Commissioner Hanson?
I would like to echo what was said earlier. I would like to understand a little bit more about actually the jurisdictions that currently that are still keeping their story pole policies. In looking at the list, the towns, they're all places where there's a lot of views. I will also add that as difficult as and expensive it was for the North 40, the North 40 specific plan, we had our own specific plan committee with, I believe, 11 people on it who met for years and years and years. The plan was under development for years and years and years. The time where it really got the town's attention was when the story poles went up. This is what always happens. And so I think we would have to think really long and hard about removing the requirement for story poles, period. That would be a very, very difficult discussion for our town. But there's probably a lot of intermediate discussions, about maybe, if you're just adding a second story addition, maybe that's not necessary especially when consider the cost relative to the cost of the development, things like that. So.
Sure. Okay.
It's Janoff.
Commissioner Janoff, I'm getting tired.
It's still Janoff. I think Commissioner Thomas raises an interesting point about what could we install to raise the flag. The other thing I'd like to comment on is the orange netting in a hillside setting like we had on this recent project was alarming. It would be, I don't know if it's possible to have beige netting instead of orange netting, but it is true that it sends a message of alarm, and that starts a negative conversation before it starts a positive one, I think. So I think that point's well taken, and yet I do agree, the conversation gets going when the netting goes up. And we hear many, many times people say, I had no idea until I saw the orange poles next to my, next door. So it really does serve as notice, even though the requirement to notice your neighbors is there, and even though the better notifications of your neighbors include renderings so you can see what it's actually going to look like in your neighborhood. Not everybody looks at those. So, what are people doing to make sure? What are communities doing to make sure neighbors are alerted? The community is alerted.
I'm going to jump in with a couple of my own. The issue is raised about whether the flagpole requirements are in violation of the housing accountability law or perhaps other statutes promoting housing. I think they would be good for the town attorney to respond to us on that issue.
Okay.
And then concerning Mr. Rutherford's email of March 23rd, he brought up the issue of flag ropes as a more feasible alternative, particularly in higher heights. And I think that comment on, or feedback on that would be helpful. And he also made a point about fencing not being allowed, which he thought was a safety issue. I thought he said a fence had been applied for but not granted. I think that was on the car dealership in particular. Okay, thank you. Commissioner Burnett and then Commissioner Thomas.
Yes, thank you, Chair. So question, what is the average length of time the story poles are up? Is there any number?
It varies greatly. Thank you for that question. It can be that it's put up and we send out the notice, and within a month, a decision's been made and the appeal period has been completed. For example, if it was a new second-story addition that stayed as a minor residential development application. But for many, it is for several months because the story poles need to go up, and then we need to notice for a public hearing, get notice in the newspaper, and then following the public hearing, even if there's only one, there then is the additional 10-day appeal period. So, and then we have some that are up for a very long time as it goes through various commission meetings or then appeals.
Okay, thank you for that. And I have a follow-up question. So,
Go ahead, please.
oh, not a question, but a comment. So another reason why I think story poles are important, there was a large home that was built in my neighborhood, and we didn't realize the mass of it until the story poles went up. And that alerted the neighbors, and we were able to meet with the contractor, the designer, the builder, and the massing was reduced. So, I mean, I think that's a key part of why story poles are important, especially in a neighborhood. You get the feeling of what it's going to be, and it's the massing and the height. And we were able to, as I say, speak with the owner builder and be able to make adjustments, which was a much better project for our neighborhood.
Thank you. And Commissioner Thomas, we want to get back to you.
Thank you. So I completely understand and agree. And like I said, the story poles tell us when a project is happening. But like with the North 40, we know it's by the time the story poles go up, it's too late really for the public and neighbors to really be heavily involved in the process of deciding what is this project is going to end up being and looking like. And so for us, I feel like story poles go up, people come to planning commission meetings, neighbors are upset because they didn't understand, and we're sitting here telling people that have gone through all of the processes they're supposed to, done everything they're supposed to do, like you have to go back to square, not 1 or 0, but like you have to go back a couple steps to like appease your neighbors. And it's not, that process is not productive. So I think that we should really try and be innovative and creative in the way that we let the public know. And maybe we need to start getting some ideas of alternatives to story polls out sooner in the process, so that the public and neighbors, specifically I think with residential projects, because I know that that's what we deal with a lot, but with residential projects or the big, giant, huge projects, like get public comment in sooner so that it can actually be taken into account. Because I think that's where there becomes so much tension. And when the North 40 thing stuff happened, people were so upset. And I know that we don't want to be a reactionary town that is like making policies after the fact to fix things. And so getting more people involved beforehand, informing people earlier on in the process is the thing that is going to make it more productive for everyone involved. And so I don't know the answer to how we do that, but I think that looking at how maybe other places have tried to do that is something that would be really helpful.
Through the chair, prior to the vice chair speaking, just for a little background. So if someone comes to the counter and says, hey, I'm thinking of doing a project, make sure you talk to your neighbors. They don't talk to their neighbors. They submit their application. We give them the comments. Make sure you talk to your neighbors. So staff does that. Many people choose not to take that option. We can't force them or require them to do that, but I want to make sure that you have that context.
Thank you. And I think that people do just hope that it squeaks by and they get it through and nothing, you know what I mean? People just won't notice the giant story polls or whatever, or it's too late in the process. But I do think that, yeah, with individuals, it's hard, but maybe with some of the bigger projects, there's something that we can do earlier on to get more people involved. So thank you.
Vice Chair Respi had a comment?
I just wanted to, and I think you raised great points. I just wanted to raise a kind of counterpoint. I think it was the Wood Road project where we had story polls up, and I guess it was very early on in the process. And the neighbors, it really, I think, yeah, it was, they were done very, so I would agree with you. Story polls, I think, are most useful if we can do it right at the outset, and it's an accurate reflection of what the project's going to be. And I think in that particular instance, not just the immediate neighbors, because those were in sight lines, the entire town had a great idea of what was proposed up on that hill. Right. Yep.
Do we have any other comments? Go ahead, Commissioner Thomas.
Thank you, Chair and Vice Chair. I totally agree that was really helpful, and it was early on in the project. So I am wondering that, I mean, I have no idea if this is even normal or possible, but is it possible for us to like explore options where if someone wants to develop something and they want to build something around the height requirement, then like putting things up earlier in the process, because we all know it doesn't reflect the massing or it doesn't reflect the mass or what the finished product is going to look like. So is that something that I see Ms. Armour maybe with an idea? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. The one caution that I would give is that it's not unusual that through the staff review process, and particularly review by the town's consulting architect, that there do end up being changes to the proposed massing of the building. And so those kinds of changes then, if it was, for example, a project that was coming to Planning Commission for review, would then necessitate changes to the story poles, additional ones being installed, and so could in the end compound the expense and requirement for those projects.
Thank you for that. So I think we're ready for a motion to continue. If there's no more specific recommendations for staff, I'm not seeing any, so I'll entertain a motion to continue. And I'll be asking staff if there's a projected date for that.
Thank you for that question. We would recommend that it be continued to May 24th. And if we need more time to prepare the information you've requested, then we could always continue it at that time.
Thank you. And Vice Chair Respi, were you raising your hand?
I probably was, so I will go ahead. So I will make a motion to continue the matter before the Planning Commission, specifically the discussion of recommendation to Town Council on modifications for town height pole and netting policy for additions and new construction, to a date certain of May 24, 2023, so that staff can gather information requested by Planning Commission and commentators received this evening.
Thank you. Is there a second? Commissioner Burnett?
I second that.
Is there discussion on the motion? Commissioner Thomas?
I know we want to go home. I just have a question about the pathway that this takes after we will make a recommendation on the 24th, and then it goes to town council, and then what happens?
So as with other recommendations that you have made, for example, the objective standards, this is something that once the Planning Commission feels they have something that they can recommend, it would go to Town Council, and then Town Council would consider the modifications to the policy.
Thank you.
Any further discussion? If not, I'll call the question. Commissioner Hanson?
Yes.
Commissioner Thomas?
Yes.
Vice Chair Raspy?
Yes.
Commissioner Burnett?
Yes.
And Commissioner Janoff?
Janoff, yes.
Yes. We'll have a private discussion about that afterwards. There's something going on. So we'll now move on to other business and request a report from the Director of Community Development. Is that Ms.
Thank
Armour?
you. Yes, I can give that report this evening. I am reporting out on recent work that the Town Council has done relevant to Planning Commission work. So on the 4th of April, the Town Council did consider and grant a story pole exception for a project at Winchester Boulevard and Shelburne Way. In addition, they did have a further discussion of the draft housing element, but no further direction was given at that time. In addition, on the topic of the housing element, the town did resubmit to HCD on March 31st, and we received a comment letter actually in regards to the adopted housing element from January. A comment letter was received on April 14th, and review with HCD is ongoing on the remaining issues that were submitted as part of the March 31st draft.
Thank you. Any questions regarding the staff report? Thank you. And we'll move on to subcommittee reports. In addition to service on the Planning Commission, commissioners serve on the several town committees, which are the Conceptual Development Advisory Commission, the GPAC, which is now Housing Element Advisory Board, and Historic Preservation Committee. And I think Commissioner Hanson is going to tell us about what happened on the 170 Twin Oaks application.
Yes. The Conceptual Development Advisory Committee had its first meeting of 2023. I believe it was last week, or maybe 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks ago. And it was supposedly about 171 Twin Oaks, but that's a little bit misleading because what it really is about is I believe it's 18 acres. It might be a little bit more than that, 18 acres of land that sits above the Surrey Farms neighborhood off of Kennedy. And this has been under a Williamson Act contract for many decades. And the Williamson Act is basically an act where you can classify property as agricultural, whether it actually is used for agriculture or not. But what it does for the landowner is they are subjected to dramatically lower property taxes because the use is not in line with a residential or commercial use. Mm-hmm. So in any case, this property has been handed down over generations. And back in 2015, they gave a notice of cancellation of the Williamson Act contract. It takes, without any intervention, it takes 10 years for the contract to expire. So that would be in 2025. And they did give such notice, but they tried to accelerate the process back in 2018. By coming up with a proposal and asking the General Plan Committee, Planning Commission, and Town Council to change the land use designation and allow them to go ahead with an architecture and site. That was ultimately, it was seen by planning commission, but the town council unanimously turned it down and basically said, we're going to let this thing expire on its own timeline. We're not going to allow it to accelerate the process. Now they're back. And they haven't asked us to accelerate the process, but now that we're in 2023, by the time they actually can get a development proposal through, it will be, basically 2025 before they can start building. So they've come with a proposal. The proposal is for, it's similar but different than the last proposal. It's for quite a few houses, 11 housing units, 2 below market price units. And then every housing unit of the 11 would have an ADU. And as we all know that we can't say anything about ADUs, but they disclose that. And so, there was a discussion about, now that we're looking at this, and this is actually maybe true for every development, we have to at least consider the fact that whenever we approve one house, it could be 3 because it could be a ADU. And so where this came into play, we had a neighborhood full of people. They were finally saying things like, well, we realize there's going to be houses up there versus, 5 years ago when they were like, no, that, they had big pictures of the deer and everything. Now they understand something will get built there. But I think they're all hoping for something less. And so we won't know until they come back, and Conceptual Development Advisory Committee is only an advisory body, but the most of the board members did recommend less units without saying how many less, because it will be lingering over that. And as we were discussing the story policy, this didn't come up in the meeting, but I thought that's a perfect example of a place where you really want the story policy because it's up the hill from all those houses in the neighborhood who thought that nothing would ever be built there. So,
Okay, thank you for that report. And historic preservation?
Is that's
That's
me?
you? Thank you.
And I want to add on to Commissioner Hanson on that project, the conceptual design. There was also the issue of if the lots could be further split after they were sold off. And that could have happened. So that was an issue that, anyway, so with the historic, it was today, and we had one item on the agenda for a home on Fillmore to be taken out of the inventory, which it was voted on to be taken out of the inventory. But they do plan to follow the design guidelines and come back with a plan that would be similar to what the home looks like, but a larger home. So that was a good outcome. So that was the only item on the agenda.
Thank you. And do we have anything for Hebe? Nope. Okay. If there's no other business, then I'll adjourn the meeting and thank everyone for participating. The meeting is adjourned. Oh, are we going to have a meeting in May?
No, the May
The
10th meeting will be canceled.
Okay, thank you.
Right?